Section 1 of Tales of English Minsters, Canterbury Cathedral, Kent, and St. Paul's Cathedral, London. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by David Wales. Tales of English Minsters, Canterbury Cathedral, Kent, and St. Paul's Cathedral, London, by Elizabeth Wilson Grierson. Section 1, Canterbury Cathedral, Kent County, Part 1. Like a mighty army moves the Church of God. Brothers, we are treading where the saints have trod. 1. When we come to visit Canterbury Cathedral, we find that there is so much to talk about that it seems as if the stories connected with it would fill a book of themselves. It is the most interesting of all our cathedrals, though I think that Winchester follows hard on its heels, and in one way it is unique, for, as you know, it is the mother cathedral of the great Church of England, for the Archbishop of Canterbury ranks first among all Anglican bishops, whether at home or in our colonies, and when difficulties arise in the Church, not only in England, but in those far-off lands, which cannot be settled by the bishops and clergy living there, it is to the Archbishop of Canterbury that they look for advice and aid. Now, perhaps you wonder why I have said the Mother Cathedral and not the Mother Church, which is not such a clumsy expression and seems to mean the same thing. But I have a reason for doing this, for when we go down among the green Kentish hop fields and enter the quaint little city lying among its pleasant meadows, it is not the cathedral standing in the middle of the town which I want you to visit first, but a tiny little red-roofed church with a square ivy-covered tower, which stands in a churchyard, which in summer is fragrant with the perfume of roses on a hillside just outside the town. This church is called St. Martin's, and tiny as it is, it can claim the proud title of the Mother Church of England. For as far as we know, it is the very oldest church in the country, and we can touch the walls, part of them built, like the tower of St. Albans Cathedral, of Roman bricks, which are standing today very much as they stood 1,300 years ago when a Christian queen worshipped here, when all her subjects and even her own husband were pagans. But how did a Christian queen come to be living in a heathen country, you ask? Well, I will tell you. As you all know, the Romans under Julius Caesar invaded and conquered Britain about 50 years before the birth of our Lord. They settled down and colonized our country, which they held for over 400 years. And curious to say, although they were heathens themselves and bitterly opposed to the spread of Christianity, it was through them that the way was opened up for the faith of Christ to be planted in our land. For they traded with France, or Gaul as it was then called, where in the 2nd century there were already Christian churches, and the people of Gaul were not slow to send missionaries across the Channel to the island from which they were beginning to obtain large quantities of wheat. And in spite of persecution from the Roman emperors, the faith spread in England, and a few churches were built here and there in the more important towns. Now, there was a colony of Romans settled at Canterbury, or as it was called in those days, Durovernum, just as there were colonies of Romans settled at York, Lincoln, Verulam, and other places we have read of, and there must have been some Christians living among them. Perhaps some of the Roman soldiers themselves believed the Christian faith, and they built a little church here on the hillside and dedicated it to St. Martin. St. Martin was a French bishop, the Bishop of Tours, and I'm going to tell you his story, partly because some people think that it was he who took an interest in the Christians at Canterbury, and perhaps came over from Gaul to found this little church, and partly because his story is such a beautiful one that I am sure you would like me to tell it to you, even if the saint had nothing to do with Canterbury at all. Now, although St. Martin was a French bishop, he was not a Frenchman. He was the son of a Roman magistrate, and he was born in Hungary about A.D. 360. When he was a boy, he heard the story of our Lord's life and death, and he made up his mind that he would be one of his followers. His parents were pagans, however, and they did not want him to become a Christian, so they made him a soldier, hoping that the excitement of a soldier's life would drive his new idea out of his head. And their plan was partly successful, for although Martin, as he moved about Gaul with his regiment, still kept the old resolve before him, and went to church sometimes, and even put down his name as a catechumen, that is, one who desired to be instructed in the Christian faith and to be baptized, he never came to the point, as we say, but just let time slip on, meaning some day, when he had more leisure, to present himself for baptism, and thus publicly declare himself a Christian. The years passed, however, and Martin grew to be a full-grown man, but although he was good and kind, he had never been baptized. Now it chanced that one winter his regiment was stationed at Amiens, and on a bitterly cold night he was walking near the city gate, perhaps he was the officer on duty and was visiting the guard, when he saw a miserable beggar with hardly any clothes on, crouching by the wall, almost perished with cold. In those days no one heeded beggars, and it would have been the most natural thing for a soldier in Martin's position to walk on and leave the poor man to die. But the young officer had learned what Christ had taught about showing mercy, and he took his thick warm cloak from his shoulders and cut it in two with his sword, and gave half of it to the beggar to protect him from the cold. The next night, so the story runs, as Martin the soldier lay sleeping in his chamber, he had a wonderful vision. The gates of heaven were opened, and he saw our Lord on a throne, surrounded by a host of saints and angels, and to his astonishment, in the midst of all the glory and brightness, he was wearing the half of a soldier's cloak. Martin recognized it as his, and while he was gazing at the scene in breathless awe, it seemed to him that Christ pointed to the cloak and said softly, "Behold the mantle given to me by Martin, yet but a catechumen." The vision faded, but the words sank into the young man's heart. If his master could so confess him in heaven for doing such a little act of mercy, he determined to be brave enough to confess him on earth, and without delay he made public profession of his faith and was baptized. And more than this, he left the army and went into a monastery and became a monk. Afterwards he was made Bishop of Tours, and we read that until he died he fought as bravely with his tongue and with his pen against errors and abuses in the Church as he had fought with his sword when he was a soldier. But now we must leave him and come back to the little church on the Kentish hillside which is called by his name. It must have fallen more or less into ruins, or at least it must have stood empty and deserted for a century or two after the Romans were recalled to Rome and the heathen Anglo-Saxons overran England. Then what happened at one or two other places happened here. As the country grew more settled, a new town arose with a new name. Durovernum became Canterbury, the burg of the men of Kent, the capital of their kingdom. Now, as you know by looking at any old map, the Angles settled on the east coast of England, taking possession of the land from the Firth of Forth to the south of Lincolnshire. The Saxons took possession of most of the middle and the south of England, and the Jutes, under their leaders Hengist and Horsa, took up their abode in Kent. And it chanced that in the 6th century a great king arose in Kent called Ethelbert, who conquered a large part of the country of the Angles and Saxons and became their overlord. He was a pagan, fierce, strong, and warlike, who worshipped Thor and Wodan, the heathen gods of the north. But he went on a visit to Gaul, and there he fell in love with a Frankish princess named Bertha, daughter of King Charibert of Paris. He loved her so much that he made up his mind at once that no other maiden should be his wife, and he went and asked her father if he would allow him to marry her. Now, as we know, Ethelbert was a very powerful monarch, and I expect he thought that King Charibert would be glad to let his daughter become his wife. But to his astonishment, the French king hesitated. He and all his family were Christians, and he knew that the Kentish king was a pagan, and although he wanted to be on friendly terms with him, it did not seem right to allow his young daughter to go alone into a heathen country. So he made one condition. If King Ethelbert would allow a Christian priest to accompany the princess, and would promise that she would be free to practice the rites of her own religion in her new home, he could marry her, but not unless. The fierce heathen king agreed to this arrangement readily. He was so accustomed to people worshipping different gods that he did not mind much what god Princess Bertha believed in, so long as she was willing to be his wife. And when he was discussing the matter, he suddenly remembered the little Christian church up on the hillside overlooking his capital, and he promised that henceforth it should belong to the princess and her chaplain, and that they might have service in it every day if they liked. King Charibert was satisfied, so the marriage took place, and Queen Bertha went away with her husband to his own country, taking with her a good bishop named Luitard to be her friend and adviser. Her story is something like the story of St. Margaret of Scotland, for, as you will one day read, St. Margaret was also a royal princess who went into a strange country and was married to a fierce warlike husband, King Malcolm Canmore, who, although he was not a heathen like King Ethelbert, was only a Christian in name, until the brave example of his gentle wife made him think of religion as he had never thought of it before. It must have been very lonely for Queen Bertha at first. Her husband's palace stood in the center of the little burg, which was surrounded, as were all towns in those days, by a high wall, so as to be guarded against any sudden attack from any enemy. These walls were pierced by gates, which were always well guarded, and we can imagine that it must have been a trial to the young queen to pass out, as we read she did every morning, through the groups of curious soldiers, who perhaps dropped scoffing words about her religion as she went through their midst to her little church, to join with her faithful friend Luitard and any other Christians she could gather together in the worship of God. But she did it, and she must have done it in such a wise and tactful way that her husband, watching to see what sort of religion hers was, came to respect it and to wish to hear more about it. So Queen Bertha, little as she thought it, was really acting as a missionary in those difficult years of her early married life, and by, as you will hear, she had her reward. Now we will leave her at Canterbury for a time, and turn our thoughts to a scene that took place in Rome some 4 years before she came to England. There was at that time a slave market in Rome, and one day a young Roman deacon of noble birth was walking through it. His name was Gregory. As he was looking with pitying eyes at the groups of slaves standing chained together in the hot sunshine, his attention was arrested by some young boys with white skins and golden hair, who had evidently been brought from some far distant country, for no slaves with faces like this had ever been seen in Rome before. Gregory paused for a moment. He felt that he would like to know where the strangers came from, for their golden hair and sweet pale faces reminded him of what he had read about the saints in heaven. "From what country do they come?" he asked at last, turning to the slave dealer who had charge of the group. "They are English, Angles," said the man, wondering if the young deacon wanted to buy one of them. "They should not be called Angles, but angels, with faces so angel-like," said Gregory sadly, his mind still full of thoughts of heaven. "They come from a kingdom called Deira," went on the merchant, hoping he had found a purchaser. "Deira," answered the young man, who was not thinking of buying slaves at all, but of how it might be possible to teach these children with the angel faces about God. "Ay, plucked from God's ire and called to Christ's mercy." "And what is the name of their king?" he asked, hoping, perhaps, to hear that the king of the Angles was a Christian. "Ella," was the reply. Now in those days a people were always on the lookout for good omens, and as Ella sounded like the beginning of the Alleluia, which Gregory was wont to sing in church, he instantly took this for a good omen. "Some day Alleluia will be sung in Ella's land," he said hopefully, and passed on out of the market, wondering more than ever how it would be possible to send missionaries to England. "If the Pope will give me leave, I will go thither myself," he said, and he went to the Pope and begged him to allow him to gather together a few other monks who would be willing to share the danger with him, and go with him as missionaries to England. The Pope would have granted his request, but the people of Rome would not hear of it, for Gregory was so much respected that they wanted to keep him among them, and the Pope listened to them, and, greatly to the young deacon's disappointment, bade him stay at home. But in a wonderfully short time Gregory became Pope himself, and had the power to send men wherever he liked. And although he had a great deal to think about in his new position, he never forgot the fair-haired boys he had seen in the market-place, and was always on the lookout for a suitable time to send men to preach the gospel to their nation. At last it came, for news was brought to him that the Christian princess Bertha had married the heathen king of Kent, and that he had allowed her to take a Christian priest to her new home and to practice her own religion. "If his wife is a Christian, he cannot refuse admittance to my monks," thought good Pope Gregory, and straightway he sent for a very brave and holy man named Augustine, and asked him if he would go, at the head of a small company of monks, and preach the gospel to the English nation. Augustine said he would, and shortly afterwards he set out at the head of a little band of followers for England. They had not gone very far, however, when their hearts failed them, and they sent their leader back to Rome to beg the Pope to allow them to return. Perhaps some of you are inclined to say "cowards" when you read this, but just think for a moment of what these men were asked to do. There were neither post offices, nor telegrams, nor trains in those days, and they were asked to set out from Rome and go, probably on foot, right across the continent of Europe to a strange land whose inhabitants they had heard spoken of as barbarous, fierce, and unbelieving, and of whose language they did not know a word. It was really very much as if we had asked one of our friends today to set out and walk right across the continent of Africa and visit some savage king on the other side, who would probably murder him as soon as he set foot in his country. But Pope Gregory was made of the stuff that martyrs are made of, and he would not allow the monks to return. He sent Augustine back to them with a letter, which we can read today if we will, telling them that having begun a good work they must not think of giving it up, and praying to God to grant that although he might not see them again on earth, he might be permitted to see the fruits of their labors in heaven. "For," added the good Pope, thinking of the earnest desire which he himself had had to go to England, "though I cannot labor with you, I shall partake in the joy of the reward, because I am willing to labor." Do you remember the parable in the Bible about the kingdom of heaven being like a grain of mustard seed, the least of all the seeds, and yet how, when it springs up, it grows into a mighty tree? I think that if Pope Gregory had been able, when he planted his grain of mustard seed, and sent away his handful of half-frightened, half-reluctant monks to look forward 1800 years and see into what an enormous and far-spreading tree English Christianity would grow, he would have been content. At last, after weary travel, the little band of missionaries arrived in England. They landed at Ebbsfleet in the Isle of Thanet, which, as you know, is the northeast corner of Kent. Augustine was a wise and prudent man, and instead of beginning to preach to the people at once, he sent a courteous message to the king at Canterbury that some strangers from Rome had arrived and would fain have an audience with him, for he knew that he would have much more chance to succeed in his mission if the king took him and his companions under his protection. Now, it seemed that King Ethelbert must have watched Queen Bertha and become interested in the religion she professed, for he said at once that he would meet the strangers and hear what they had to say. But because he believed in witchcraft, and was very much afraid that they might have the power to bewitch him, he would not meet them in any house, where he thought spirits had more power, but went right on out into the country to a wide chalk down, and there he gave audience to the little band of foreigners. St. Augustine could not speak to him in his own language, but he could speak the language of the people of Gaul, and he had taken the precaution to bring an interpreter over from Gaul with him. So he stood there before the king, who was seated in rude state on the green turf, and explained the Christian faith to him, and the Frankish interpreter at his side translated his words as he went on. When he had finished, the king spoke, telling him that his words seemed fair, but that they were new and strange, and that he could not give up the gods of his fathers for them, but that he was willing to shelter and protect him and his monks, and to allow them to preach in his kingdom. Then he went back to Canterbury, and in a very short time he sent an invitation to the strangers to come to his capital. And so it was that Christianity came back to England, to the middle and south of it at least, for, as you may know, it was brought to Scotland and Northumbria about the same time by St. Columba and his followers, who came from Ireland, where the faith of Christ still held sway, not having been destroyed by the Jutes and Angles and Saxons as it had been in Britain. If we could have stood at the side of St. Martin's Church on the day when St. Augustine and his monks entered the burgh of the men of Kent, we should have seen a strange sight. Indeed, it has been described so accurately to us by the Venerable Bede that we can almost picture it to ourselves. We can imagine how the news must have spread in the little city that the strangers from Rome, to talk to whom the king himself had gone to the Isle of Thanet, were coming to live among them, and explain to them, if they would listen, their queen's religion. And we could fancy how they would throng up this hilly road that passes the church, for they knew that this was the way the strangers would come, and perhaps they would stop and crowd together just by the church, for I think Queen Bertha would be there with Bishop Leodard, ready to welcome her fellow Christians and to pray for the success of their mission. And by the faint sound of singing would be heard, and a strange little procession would come over the crest of the hill. First came two monks, one carrying high in the air a silver cross, and the other a board on which was rudely traced the crucified figure of our Lord. Then came the rest of the monks in their dark and travel-stained gowns, with their leader, St. Augustine, in their midst. They were chanting a litany as they walked. One moment, thinking of the heathen darkness that lay over the fair land into which they had come, they were praying that God should turn away his wrath from the city, and the next, remembering with thankful hearts how they had been brought in safety to the end of their long and dangerous journey, they were bursting into the word of praise, which Gregory had taken for his word of good omen in the Roman marketplace, Alleluia, Alleluia. It would take too long to tell all that happened to St. Augustine and his monks. We must hurry on to the history of the cathedral, so I will only tell you that he preached constantly in the little church of St. Martin, and that the king must sometimes have gone with his wife to listen to him. For in a year we find that he became a Christian and was baptized by St. Augustine. Indeed, some people tell us that the very font that was used at the ceremony is standing in St. Martin's today. Now, King Ethelbert did not do things by halves, and when he was converted he must have thrown all his influence on the side of the missionaries, for great numbers of his subjects were baptized also, and in no very long time we hear of him helping his nephew, the King of the East Saxons, to build a cathedral in London, and found a bishopric there. He also handed over his palace in Canterbury to St. Augustine and his friend, telling them that they could turn it into a monastery, while he and Queen Bertha retired to Reculver, which stands near the coast some miles distant, where he built another royal residence. This, then, was the beginning of the great cathedral, which stands in the middle of the little city of Canterbury. For Augustine founded not only a monastery, but a church, which was known as Christ Church. And, as has always happened in the building of our Minsters, this original church was burned, rebuilt, and improved, added to, and burned again, then rebuilt, until it has grown into the magnificent structure which we see before us today. As was natural, the Roman missionary always looked to his friend Pope Gregory for help and advice in all his difficulties, and this is how the English Church came to be under the yoke of Rome for so many long years. This yoke grew to be so heavy that it could not be borne, and it was thrown off at the Reformation. But just at first we can easily understand the comfort it would be to Augustine to send letters to Gregory, telling him all his troubles, and asking him what he should do, and what rules he should lay down for the guidance of the Christian congregations which were beginning to be formed all over the country. And Gregory sent back very wise and comforting answers. We can read some of his letters still, telling Augustine to go to Gaul and there be ordained Archbishop of England by the Frankish bishops, then, with their help, to ordain some of his most trusted monks to be bishops under him, whom he could appoint to rule over different parts of England. Now, the royal palace of Canterbury, which the king had given to Augustine, covered a great deal of space, for besides the actual dwelling house, there were gardens and pleasure grounds round about it, and we know that in those pleasure grounds stood a ruined Roman temple. And like a wise man, St. Augustine made the most of the present he had received. Not content with founding Christ Church on one side of the piece of ground, he founded another church, the Church of St. Pancras, on the other side, just where the Roman temple stood, and between them, perhaps using the palace itself as part of the buildings, he founded a monastery, which he dedicated to St. Peter and St. Paul. But this name did not continue long, for before the monastery was completed, the great missionary archbishop had died, and although at first he was buried in the grounds, by the roadside we are told, when the building was completed his body was taken up and laid to rest within its walls, and from that time it was known as the Monastery of St. Augustine. Now that we have learned the story of the beginning of Canterbury Cathedral, let us approach it by the narrow streets of the little city and look at it as it stands today. It is somewhat difficult to describe, for it is so old and vast, and has been improved and added to so often, that although the principal part of the edifice is very regular, being built, as is usual, in the form of a cross, with a great square tower, crowned by 4 little spires in the center, and 2 other towers, each with 4 little spires also, at the west end, there are numberless little offshoots and towers and turrets, each bearing its own name and having its own history. For long ago the archbishops of Canterbury were not only ministers of religion, but ministers of state as well. And they not only ruled the church, but they helped the king to rule the state, and to make laws, just as the prime minister does today. So they were very important dignitaries indeed, and held their courts as if they were kings, and received all sorts of people, and transacted all manner of business, so that the archbishop's palace at Canterbury was almost as important a place as the king's palace at Westminster. So when we walk about the cathedral and its precincts, we are not only treading where the saints have trod, but we are treading where proud kings and fierce soldiers and scheming statesmen have trod as well, some of whom, it seems to us, did not deserve to be named with the saints at all. But we dare not pass judgment on them, for they lived in fierce and turbulent times, and their actions cannot be measured by our standards, and each of them did their part, by fair deeds, or by deeds that do not look so fair, in the building up of this great country of ours. When we enter the enormous church, there is one peculiarity that we notice at once. It rises up from the nave, which is the lowest part of it, by flights of steps to the highest part, which is the high altar, and the chapel behind it, in which the shrine of St. Thomas à Becket once stood. As you see, the nave is shut off from the choir by a stone screen, which is pierced by 3 doors, one of which leads into the choir, the other 2 into the side aisles and transepts. This screen can only be reached by going up a flight of stone steps, and when we pass through it and enter what is known as Trinity Chapel, we have once more to ascend a flight of steps, which are called the Pilgrim Steps. I will tell you the meaning of this curious name later on. Perhaps the very first thing that we want to see in this wonderful church is St. Augustine's chair, which stands in the east end of the building, in a curious little circular chapel known as the Corona, or Becket's crown. When we look at this great chair, fashioned out of 3 blocks of Purbeck marble, our thoughts travel back along the centuries, and we seem to see a long chain, every link of which is a man stretching between St. Augustine on the one hand and the present Archbishop of Canterbury, Dr. Davidson, on the other. For this is the chair in which all the archbishops of Canterbury are enthroned. Some people are of opinion that it was King Ethelbert's throne, and that he gave it to St. Augustine to be his bishop's stool. Others think that it was not placed here until some centuries later, but whether St. Augustine sat in it or not, we know that it is very, very old, and we look at it with awe as we think of the long line of men, some of whose names are almost forgotten now, who have come, one after the other, all down the ages, to take their seats upon it, thus signifying to all the world that they were entering into St. Augustine's office and assuming the great and solemn responsibilities which that office implies. Let us think of the stories of a few of these men on whom so much responsibility rested. When we look at the long roll of archbishops, the first name of note after St. Augustine's is Theodore. Do you know where he came from? He was sent from Rome, but he was really a Greek, and he had been born and brought up in the city of Tarsus, the birthplace of St. Paul. Perhaps the schoolboys who read this book will not love this Theodore of Tarsus, for he it was who introduced the teaching of Greek into England. He founded a school at Canterbury and had the pupils taught his own language. He also divided the country into dioceses and placed a bishop over each, teaching these bishops to look to the Archbishop of Canterbury as their head. And little as we may think it, this was a great work for England. For before Theodore's time, each bishop had settled down under the protection of a king, and so had simply been the chief minister of that kingdom. Thus, the Archbishop of Canterbury had been the bishop of the kingdom of Kent, the Bishop of London, the Bishop of the East Saxons, the Bishop of Lichfield, the Bishop of Mercia, and so on. But when Archbishop Theodore created new dioceses which were not measured by the boundaries of the various small kingdoms, and when the bishops of these dioceses learned to look to Canterbury for orders and advice rather than to their own petty kings, then an object lesson was given, and the first step was taken towards the breaking up of those smaller kingdoms and having one king to rule over all the land. That was the piece of work which Theodore did for the good of the Church and the building up of the English nation. Then there was an archbishop named Cuthbert who caused the Creed and the Lord's Prayer to be taught to the people in their own tongue, and not in Latin, which they could not understand. He wrought this work for the Church at large, but there was another work which he wrought for his own cathedral church at Canterbury, which is very amusing, and shows that he must have had a keen sense of humour. In those old days a church was apt to grow famous not so much for the piety of the people who worshipped there, as for the number of holy men who chanced to be buried within its walls. We can see examples of this in the way in which every church of note had its shrine, containing the body of its particular saint. Now, we know that St. Augustine was buried in his monastery and not in his cathedral church, and the archbishops who succeeded him followed his example, and gave orders that they were to be buried in the monastery also. And so it came about that there were no great men buried in the church at all, and strangers who came to Canterbury passed the cathedral by and flocked to the monastery to pray beside St. Augustine's grave. "This will never do," said Archbishop Cuthbert to himself, and he quietly wrote to the Pope and to the King of Kent, asking that, when his time came to die, he might be laid to rest in the cathedral. His request was granted, but he said not a word to anyone. He kept the letters and bided his time, for he knew that if the monks of St. Augustine's came to know of the slight he was about to cast on their monastery, they would try to thwart his design. At last the day came that he lay a-dying, and his friends gathered round his bed with tearful faces. But the archbishop was not tearful. He was not afraid to die, and he was glad to think that after his death he would be able to render a service to the church of which he was so proud. So he drew out the letters he had received from king and pope, and showed them to his astonished friends, and told them where he desired to be buried. Then, with a touch of humour, which makes us feel that he must have been a very shrewd and human old man, he added, "Bury me first, toll the bell afterwards." So his friends buried him hurriedly and in secret. Then, after they had filled in his grave and built up the stones again, they tolled the great bell mournfully to let all Canterbury know that the Archbishop had passed away. When the abbot and monks of the monastery came to claim, as was their wont, the body of the primate, they were told, to their wrathful astonishment, that he was already buried, and they were shown the letters and taken to see his grave, which, of course, they could not disturb. After this, all the archbishops were buried in the cathedral, and, as we shall see later on, there was one of them who, if he were not a great saint, at least was so famous that after his death his shrine became a place of pilgrimage, not only for English people, but for people from all over Europe. Then there were Archbishop Dunstan and Archbishop Alphege, St. Dunstan and St. Alphege, as they came to be called, who were buried on either side of the high altar. They had magnificent shrines, no trace of which remains today, save a piece of carved stone, which formed part of St. Dunstan's shrine. And yet these men, whose names seem so vague to us, were great and noble figures in their time. St. Dunstan helped to mould the destinies of England. St. Alphege died for his faith, and, like St. Alban at Verulam, helped to swell the English ranks of the noble army of martyrs. St. Dunstan was a little fair-haired, delicate Somersetshire boy who was born at Glastonbury, where a famous abbey stood. His father, Hurston, was a rich thane, who owned lands and vassals, and in the winter evenings, when these vassals were gathered together in the great hall round the blazing fire, they sang songs and told stories to one another, and little Dunstan listened to them, and grew so fond of the old songs and stories that he never forgot them all his life long. He was passionately fond of music, and persuaded an old harper to teach him to play on the harp, and when he grew older and travelled about, visiting first at one nobleman's house, then at another, as befitted a young man of his rank, he always carried his harp with him, and charmed the fair ladies whom he met with the beautiful music he could draw from its strings. He was very fond of reading, too, and there were plenty of books in the Abbey of Glastonbury for him to pore over, and in time he became known as one of the most learned and cultured youths of his day. Then he went to court, and would doubtless have become a great courtier, and perhaps might have idled away his time playing on his harp, and talking about literature to the Queen and her ladies, if it had not been for the unkindness of some of the nobles whom he met there. They were jealous of him, of his good looks and sunny nature, and his skill in music and learning. So one day, when he was out riding in a marshy part of the country, they set on him, pulled him off his horse, threw him into the marsh, trampled him under foot, and left him for dead. He was not dead, however, but he was so badly hurt that he had a long illness afterwards, and during the days and weeks when he was lying helpless, he had time to think about many things, about his life and what use he could make of it. And by the time he had recovered, he had made up his mind that instead of being a courtier, he would be a monk. I cannot tell you all that happened during his long life. He first became Abbot of Glastonbury, then Bishop of Worcester, and then Archbishop of Canterbury. Now, as I have already told you, in those days the Archbishops of Canterbury were practically Prime Ministers of England as well, and Dunstan was both a good Archbishop and a wise Prime Minister. In his time, the Danes had conquered a large part of the country and had settled down to live there. But instead of conducting themselves like peaceable citizens, they behaved like thieves and robbers, and naturally the English people feared and hated them, and were constantly at war with them, trying to drive them out of the country. The wise archbishop knew that they would never be able to do this, so he tried to make the Danes take an interest in the land and learn to look on it as their home by giving them good laws and treating them firmly but justly. And in his time, at least, the plan succeeded. He also encouraged foreigners from France and Germany to come and trade with England, and it was in his days that London first began to grow into a great city. He made laws about the coinage of our money, and saw that just weights and measures were used by traders, so that poor people would not be oppressed and wronged. After Archbishop Dunstan came Archbishop Alphege, the martyr. I told you that St. Dunstan had treated the Danes very kindly and wisely, but after his death the king, Ethelred, who was a very foolish young man, and had never taken the archbishop's advice about anything, determined to make one great effort to rid the country of them by putting them all to death. So he gave orders that on a certain night the Saxons were to kill all the Danes who were living, many of them quite peaceably, in their midst. This was done, but, as you may think, dire vengeance followed the treacherous act. As soon as the news of the massacre reached Sweyn, King of Denmark, he at once swore a great oath that he would never rest until he had conquered England and avenged his murdered people. Accordingly, he gathered together an immense force of Norsemen and Danes, and descended on the shores of England, and for 4 long years they harried the country, burning towns and homesteads wherever they went. When it was known that they were approaching Canterbury, the archbishop was advised to fly for his life as long as there was time. But to the brave old man such an act would have been a betrayal of the trust committed to him by God. "God forbid that I should tarnish my character by such an inglorious deed," he exclaimed, "and be afraid to go to heaven, because a violent death might lead me there." So he remained at his post, a true priest of God to the end, and passed triumphantly to his reward through the violent death which he had looked forward to so calmly. When the cathedral was attacked, he and his monks locked themselves in the great church, hoping that its walls would be strong enough to protect them, and they might have been had the Danes not used their most deadly weapon, fire. As an old writer tells us, they brought barrels and piled them together and set them alight. Then they threw them on the roof, and their heat melted the lead with which it was covered, so that it ran down like rain on the poor men inside, who were like to be roasted alive. Then the brave archbishop, gathering his monks around him, flung open the door and begged mercy for his little flock of the wild heathen warriors, offering willingly to become a prisoner himself if they were allowed to go free. It was in vain. All the monks except 4, who managed to escape, were at once put to death, and Alphege was led away a prisoner, not that the Danes wanted to spare him, but they hoped that the Saxon king might offer to pay a ransom for him. But poor cowardly Ethelred thought only of his own safety, and fled over the sea to Normandy, so no ransom came from him. The country people, who loved their good archbishops, did their utmost to gather enough money together to rescue him, but he heard this and sent messengers to them, telling them to desist, for, as he said, "there is enough misery in the country without people being made poorer for my sake." So the Danes became tired of waiting for money, and after 7 weeks they led Alphege out to die in their husting or public meeting place at Greenwich. And to make their cruelty more cruel, the savage sea rovers determined that his death should give them a little amusement. So they placed him in the center, and stood around in a ring, and pelted him with stones, and with the sharp horns of oxen, just as, 1,000 years before, men had stoned St. Stephen outside the gates of Jerusalem. It is terrible to read of such things being done in this peaceful England of ours, is it not? And we feel thankful to the unknown Dane, who, more merciful than the rest of his countrymen, struck the archbishop on the head with his axe, and so put an end to his sufferings. After he was dead, his mangled body was buried at Greenwich, and the sad story seemed to be at an end. End of section 1. Section 2 of Tales of English Minsters, Canterbury Cathedral, Kent, and St. Paul's Cathedral, London, by Elizabeth Wilson Grierson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Section 2, Canterbury Cathedral, Kent County, Part 2. But now comes in one of those incidents which make these old cathedrals we are learning about so full of interest and such wonderful links with the past. For King Sweyn of Denmark died just when he had succeeded in conquering England, and Canute, his son, reigned in his stead. This Canute was a wonderful man, one of the most wonderful men in history. From a heathen and a barbarian, he turned into a Christian and a wise king. In his time, the English people had peace, and by the justice and wisdom of his rule, he taught them to forget that he was an alien and a foreigner. Among his other good qualities, he had a great care for God's house and God's ministers, and when it was told him how 16 years before his father's followers had murdered the Archbishop of Canterbury, he immediately set to work to make what reparation lay in his power. He had St. Alphage's poor crushed bones taken from their humble grave at Greenwich and brought back in solemn state, and with all the marks of honour he could render, to his cathedral church, which in the years that had passed since his death had been rebuilt and restored. And after the bones had been laid to rest beside the altar, the great and powerful monarch, whom every one looked up to and feared, lifted the golden crown from his head and handed it to the clergy, asking them to hang it up at the head of the great cross which hung in the nave, as a token that he was sorry for, and would fain have undone, the cruel deed of his countrymen. Soon after Alphege came 2 foreign archbishops, Lanfranc and Anselm, whose names will live in history. Although they were friends and fellow countrymen, both of them being Italians, and although they came to Canterbury from the same little Norman monastery, they were very different in character. The story of the little monastery itself would interest you, had I time to tell you about it, how it was called the Monastery of Bec, because it stood down in a wooded valley beside a little beck or stream; how the first abbot, Herline, was a soldier before he turned a monk; how he was so poor that he had to build his first tiny house with his own hands; and how he was making an oven when Lanfranc found him out, and asked if he might join him. But we must pass over all that, and go on to the time when Herline was dead and Lanfranc was abbot in his stead. Now Lanfranc, as well as being good and learned, was what we call a practical man; that is, when there was anything to be done, he not only saw the very best way to do it, but he would do it himself if need be, or direct other men to do it. And the Norman Duke William, when he conquered England, needed such men to help him to arrange matters in his new kingdom. So he sent for him and made him Archbishop of Canterbury. There is a very pretty story told of how William and Lanfranc first came to be such friends. At the time when the Duke got into trouble with the Pope because he had married his cousin Matilda, Lanfranc was abbot of Bec, and not being afraid of anyone, not even of William himself, he sided with the Pope, and made no secret that he did so. William was so angry when he heard this, that he ordered Lanfranc to leave Normandy at once. The fearless abbot obeyed, and set out from his monastery on the only horse he possessed, which was very lame, and went hirpling along on 3 legs. Of course he did not get on very quickly, and William, who was foaming with rage, and who had ridden to Bec himself to see if the abbot had obeyed his orders, overtook him in a narrow lane. Can you picture the scene to yourselves? The angry Duke on his great charger, and the humble monk with all his worldly belongings strapped on his back, jogging along on his poor lame jennet. "Thou shouldst obey my orders better, and make more haste to get out of the country," said William haughtily. "Give me a better horse, and I will go the quicker," said the abbot good-humouredly, with a twinkle in his eye. It was the soft answer that turns away wrath, for William was so amused that he burst out laughing, and ever afterwards the two men were the best of friends, and William took Lanfranc's advice in everything. Indeed, Lanfranc was almost as great a man in England as the Conqueror himself, and to his credit, be it said, he used his immense power wisely and well. Like St. Dunstan, he was more of a statesman than a priest, yet he found time in the midst of his law-making to attend to his cathedral, which had been allowed to fall into such a state of dilapidation that it was almost a ruin. He pulled down what remained of it and built it again, and we can see some of his work in the crypt. By and by, the Norman king died, flung from his horse, if you remember, at Mantes in France, and his friend, the Norman archbishop, only lived long enough to place his crown on the head of his son, William Rufus, or William the Red. Then he died also, and the archbishop's throne at Canterbury was empty. Now, Red William was a very different man from his father. The Conqueror had been stern and ruthless, but he had ever cared for the Church and for good men. As someone has said of him, he was stark to rebel and baron, but he was mild to those who loved God. Red William neither feared God himself nor honored those who did. So, instead of appointing a new archbishop to fill Lanfranc's place, he left the throne of Canterbury empty, and put the money that belonged to it into his own coffers. It was very wrong and very wicked, but it did not trouble him at all, until one day he was seized with illness and was like to die. Then he was frightened. I am afraid we cannot say he repented, but he was frightened, and his thoughts turned to the man who was abbot of Bec in Lanfranc's place. The name of this man was Anselm, and he was the most gentle, loving, and saintly abbot you can imagine. He was so kind and humble and altogether good that his fame had spread not only through Normandy, but also through England. It chanced that at this particular time he was on a visit to England, and the sick king sent for him, and, much against his will, forced him to become archbishop. Anselm did not in the least want to be archbishop. He was a great student, and he would much have preferred to live on quietly at Bec. But when the post was forced upon him, he did not shrink from the responsibility, but stood up bravely for what was right. And because of this he had a very troubled life. For, after all, the Red King recovered, and when he recovered, he broke all the promises which he had made on his sick-bed, and persecuted poor Archbishop Anselm because he would not do what he wished him to do, driving him out of the country, and heaping all manner of insults and abuse on him, until I think the sweet-tempered old man must have been almost broken-hearted. But he never agreed to do what he thought was wrong, and yet he never grew bitter and discourteous, but was always meek and gentle and forgiving, and at last, after Rufus was dead, and his son Henry had recalled him to England, he died peacefully at Canterbury, and was buried beside his friend Lanfranc, in the nave of the cathedral. Lanfranc's tomb has disappeared, but if we go into this little chapel far up in the choir, we can see where Anselm's remains now rest. As we stand beside his grave, shall I tell you a few stories about him? They are worth telling, for they show us what kind of a man he was, and I think when you have heard them, you will agree with me that of all the great men who have sat on St. Augustine's chair, and whose bodies have been laid to rest here, there is no one who deserves the name of saint more than he did. As I said before, he was an Italian, and he was born at Aosta, not so very far from the birthplace of St. Hugh of Lincoln. It is a very beautiful country, where rich valleys run up among the snow-tipped Alps, and where little Anselm was picking bright spring flowers in the meadows, or playing in autumn in the harvest fields, he could look up at these great snow mountains, whose summits seemed to touch the clouds. There is one story told of him when he was a child, which reminds us somewhat of the story that is told of St. Cuthbert when he was a shepherd lad among the hills by the Tweed. Anselm's father was a violent and passionate man, but his mother was a gentle, good woman who used to take her little boy on her knee and tell him about the great God who lived up in heaven, and from his throne directed all the things on earth. And little Anselm, who was a thoughtful child, used to ponder these things, and when, in the mornings and evenings, he saw the rays of the rising and setting sun light up the tops of the mountains, turning them into rosy pink and burning gold, he made up his mind that heaven was up there among the snow peaks, and that God's palace was just where the light was strongest. And he thought so much about this that one night he dreamt a dream. He dreamt that a call came to him to go to the mountains, to the palace of the great king. So he rose from his bed and set out. And it seemed to him that before he reached the mountains, he had to pass through yellow harvest fields full of ripening grain. There were a great many maidens there reaping, but instead of working hard, they were idling their time away, talking and laughing to one another. And all at once Anselm seemed to see that these were not ordinary peasant maidens, but that they were servants of the great king, who lived in the palace on the mountain tops. And he made up his mind that when he got up there, he would tell God how idle they all were. Thinking thus, he went on his way up and up, until at last he reached the heavenly palace. And there, to his astonishment, he found only the great king and his chief butler, for all the other servants had been sent into the valley to reap. And as he stood and looked in through the door, the Lord called to him and told him to sit down at his feet, and asked him his name and where he came from and what he wanted. And the lad answered all his questions as truthfully as he could, only I think that he forgot to tell about the idle girls in the cornfields, for he would begin to see that he too was a little servant of the king, and that he had not always worked as diligently as he might have done. Then the Lord ordered his butler to go and bring some food to the weary little lad, and the man brought the whitest bread that Anselm had ever seen, and he ate it, and all his weariness vanished. Then he awoke, and lo and behold, he was in his little trundle bed at home. It is a quaint and fanciful story, is it not? Yet it influenced the whole of the great archbishop's life. For he really believed that he had been in heaven, and that God had fed him, and ever afterwards he realized what is so hard for most of us to realize, that heaven is quite close to earth, not somewhere very far away, and that, if we will, we can do our work here on earth, as the girls in the harvest field might have done, with their eyes fixed on the glories of the king's palace. And this taught him not to draw a line, as we all are apt so to do, between what we might call his everyday work and his Sunday work. To him one seemed just as sacred as the other. Because he was a monk and abbot of Bec, he had to be a great deal in church, and say a great many prayers, and study the Bible, but he found time to do common things as well. He was always ready to sympathize with anyone in trouble, and to give them advice, or to go into the classroom in the monastery and listen to the teaching there. And he would take notice of the dull boys, and try to show their masters how to make their lessons interesting, so that they would learn them more easily. And at night, when all the rest of the monks were asleep, he would go softly into the infirmary, if there was any monk lying sick there, and sit beside him and shake up his pillows. And if he were very ill, as one poor man once was, he used to peel grapes and squeeze the juice between his hot lips to try and moisten his poor parched tongue. He loved all animals. Once, after he became Archbishop of Canterbury, he was out riding near Windsor with his attendants. As they rode through the forest, they startled a hare, and immediately the young men and their dogs gave chase. There was no chance of escape for the poor frightened little creature, and at last it came and crouched down, stupefied with terror, under Anselm's horse. Everyone crowded round, laughing thoughtlessly at the easy way in which it had been captured, but the tears came into the Archbishop's eyes at the sight of its distress, and he ordered all the dogs to be called off, and allowed it to escape. But although he was kind and gentle, he was no coward. As we read before, William Rufus behaved very badly to him because he would not obey him in matters where he thought the king was wrong. This made Rufus very angry, but Anselm did not mind. He spoke out boldly and let the monarch do his worst. Once William summoned a great council of bishops and barons to decide what should be done with this old man who cared more for God's smile than for royal favors. I am afraid some of the other bishops were cowards who wanted to please the king, so they did not defend Anselm as they ought to have done, but turned against him because they saw he was likely to get into trouble and be driven out of England. The council was a noisy one. Some of the members said one thing and some another, and they all became very excited, while the king grew more and more angry. And what do you think Anselm did, to whom it meant so much? Do you think he sat listening and trembling and begging his brother bishops to come to his help? Not a bit of it. He made his defense in quiet, dignified words. Then, seeing that everyone was so angry that they could not decide what to do with him, he rose quietly and walked out of the hall, telling them that when they had made up their minds they could come and tell him. Then he went into the church and said his prayers, and sat quietly down to wait. And when at last the bishops came to look for him, they found him, leaning his head against the wall, having fallen into calm sleep. It was no wonder that such a man was not afraid of the anger of kings, and that at last even his enemies came to admire his peaceful, holy life. 2. And now we come to the most famous archbishop of all, Thomas à Becket, known as St. Thomas of Canterbury. Somehow we do not think of him as a saint in the same way as we think of St. Cuthbert of Durham, or St. Hugh of York, or St. Anselm, who were content to eat poor fare and live in rough lodgings, and face hardships, and go weary journeys for the sake of Christ and his gospel. But all the same, Thomas à Becket had a courage of his own. Although he was haughty and headstrong, he lost his life rather than yield to the king in a matter where he thought he was right, and we cannot help honoring anyone who is ready to die rather than be untrue to his convictions. This is the story of Thomas's life. After William the Norman conquered England, large numbers of his countrymen flocked across the Channel. Among them was a silk mercer of Rouen called Gilbert à Becket. He settled in London and set up a little shop in Cheapside, and he seemed to have prospered greatly. For in a course of time we find he became pourtreve of the city, which was something like being Lord Mayor. He also built a chapel in St. Paul's churchyard, which shows that he was a wealthy man. He had one little son named Thomas, and a gentle, pious wife who was very kind to the poor, and who was in the habit, when her little boy's birthday came around, of weighing him in a pair of scales against a pile of money, clothes, and provisions, which she afterwards carried with her own hands to destitute folk who needed them. The boy was brought up in luxury, as befitted his father's wealth and position, and he had for his friends all the young Norman nobles and barons. He went to Oxford, then to the University of Paris, and when his education was finished, he was one of the gayest and most fashionable young men in London. He was very daring and very witty, and there was much that was noble about him, for he was ever true to his friends, true to his word, true even to his favorite animals. One day he was riding out with a party of his companions on a hawking expedition, when his hawk, tired with the chase, fell into a mill-lade, and, too exhausted to rise from the water, was in danger of being carried by the current under the mill-wheel. To everyone's astonishment, her master, seeing her danger, flung himself from his horse and plunged into the water, and at grave peril to his own life rescued her. It was a brave deed, and we feel that we should have loved the young gallant who took so much trouble for the sake of a poor tired bird. At last something happened which must have seemed very hard at the time to the handsome young man, although he did not regret it in after years. His father, the rich merchant, lost nearly all his money, and his son had to look about for something to do instead of merely amusing himself, as he had hitherto done. He was clever and well educated, and he determined to become a priest, thinking, no doubt, that with his abilities he would soon obtain a comfortable appointment. Now, it chanced that at this time the country had fallen into a great state of misery and confusion. King Stephen had been chosen king in place of his cousin Matilda, and although he had been forced to sign the Great Charter, he had not held to the promises made in it, but governed the country so badly that bloodshed and crime and lawlessness prevailed everywhere. Things were in such a state that it seemed almost hopeless to dream of better times, and had it not been for the strength and prudence of one man, these better times might not have come. That man's name was Theobald, one of the archbishops of Canterbury. He determined to invite Matilda's son Henry, who was Count of Normandy and Anjou, to come to England, hoping that the English people would take him to rule over them when Stephen died, and that he would prove a better king than Stephen had been. He wanted someone to help him to carry out his plans, however, and the brilliant young scholar priest, who was of Norman birth himself, and who was on friendly terms with all the English nobles, seemed the very man to aid him. So Thomas à Becket came to Canterbury to be the friend and confidant of the archbishop. I expect that he was delighted, as any young man would have been when he got the appointment, thinking that his fortune was made. I wonder what he would have thought as he rode down the leafy Kentish lanes to his new home if he could have read the future and seen how the remainder of his brilliant, stormy life was to be connected with it, how he was to be enthroned as archbishop and die a violent death there, and there also be laid to his long rest. At present, however, everything looked bright. Becket was sent over the sea to invite the Count of Anjou to come to England. Henry came and was accepted by the English people as heir to the crown. Soon afterwards Stephen died, and he succeeded to the throne, and it was only natural that he should show great favour to the young priest who had taken such a part in placing him upon it. So Becket was made Chancellor of England, and as he was about the same age as the new king, the two young men became great friends. They rode and hunted together, and sometimes played jokes with each other, just like two schoolboys. When the king had a war with France, Becket fought for him at the head of 700 knights. In fact, the youthful chancellor was much more of a soldier and a courtier than a priest. But once again a great change was coming in his life. Archbishop Theobald died, and to everyone's astonishment, especially to the astonishment of Becket himself, Henry insisted that he should succeed him. The truth was that Henry had made up his mind to lessen the power of the Church. In other words, he wanted to have the right to rule the affairs of the Church as he ruled the affairs of the nation, and he thought that if Becket, being his bosom friend, became archbishop, he would help him to do this. But he did not know the man with whom he had to deal. He had very little respect himself for the Church or for religion, and misled by his chancellor's gay dress and reckless manners, he thought that he had the same. But although up till now Becket had been more of a soldier than a priest, down at the bottom of his heart he had a strict sense of right and wrong, and he knew that if he were to be a worthy archbishop, his life must be different to what it had been. He was quite content with his office of chancellor, however, so he tried to persuade Henry to appoint someone else to the primacy. "A fine figure you are choosing to lead your monks at Canterbury," he exclaimed, when the king spoke to him on the subject, pointing to the rich garments which he wore. When Henry insisted, he spoke more gravely. "You will soon hate me as much as you love me now," he said, "for you assume an authority in the affairs of the Church to which I shall never assent." But Henry was determined to have his own way. He did not dream that any man would dare to oppose him, and Becket became archbishop. Then came trouble that lasted till the end. Henry demanded more power in the management of ecclesiastical affairs. Becket refused to grant it. It is a sad story, a story of a broken friendship and hasty words whose consequences could never be recalled. We cannot help admiring Becket, although perhaps he was too unbending, too ready to stand on his rights. As soon as he was made archbishop, he changed the whole manner of his life. He had been gay and heedless and luxurious before. Now he was grave and self-controlled and lived much more plainly. He had told the king before his appointment that he did not intend to yield to his demands, and he held to his decision, although everyone, even the Pope, urged him to give way a little. At last the quarrel became so great that his life was in danger, and he had to fly, disguised, from the country. He was absent for 6 years, but never once did he think of yielding, although it became plain to everyone that by holding to his own opinions in the way he did, he was really putting himself in the wrong. At last Henry paid a visit to Normandy and met his old friend, now his enemy, at a place called Tredeval. After some argument, he agreed to let bygones be bygones, and to allow Becket to return to England. But the reconciliation cannot have been very complete, for no sooner had the Archbishop departed than Henry exclaimed impatiently, "Will no man rid me of this turbulent priest?" Alas, these were like other angry words, spoken in haste without any thought of their consequences, and the king repented of them all his life afterwards. For there were 4 of his knights standing by when he uttered them, Fitzhurst, Morville, de Tracy, and Lebret, who took them for permission to murder Becket, and without further ado they determined to follow him to England. Meanwhile, the Archbishop had reached Canterbury in safety, and had been greeted by a joyous welcome from the people of Kent, who had ever loved him dearly, and had once more taken up his abode in the palace. Now let us go into the tiny northwest transept which opens from the north aisle, the Chapel of the Martyrdom, as it has come to be called, for it was here that the terrible deed took place that filled not only England, but Europe, with horror. We will not remain in it at present, but go through this low door at the opposite side, and then we shall find ourselves in the cloisters. You all know what cloisters are? The long, vaulted stone corridors, or arcades, where the monks used to spend most of their time when they were not in their cells or in church, reading, writing, or talking. These cloisters almost always formed 4 sides of a square, the centre of which was open to the sky and carpeted with smooth green turf. On one side the cloister walls were pierced by arched windows, which, however, were not filled with glass, so that they were really almost like stone verandas. So the monks had plenty of fresh air. Indeed, they sometimes had too much, for we read of a monk at Canterbury writing to a friend in France, and telling him that he would have to give up writing entirely until the spring, as his fingers were so stiff and swollen with the cold that he could no longer hold the pen. In many places these cloisters, with their beautiful carving, have been destroyed, but here at Canterbury they are perfect, and we can walk around them and look at the smooth green square of turf which they enclose, which is now used as a burying place. Well, if we stand at the corner of these cloisters, just where the door leads into them from the Chapel of the Martyrdom, and look across in a slanting direction to the opposite corner, we will see where the bishop's palace stood in the time of Becket. It was connected with that corner of the cloisters, just as the cathedral is joined to this corner. About 5 o'clock on a dark December evening, just 4 days after Christmas, Becket was seated in his chamber at the palace talking to his friends, while in the dimly lit church the monks were singing vespers. Suddenly the seneschal appeared and announced that 4 knights had come from France, from the king, bearing a message to the archbishop. Becket must have known that their coming meant no good to him, but he showed no sign of fear, and ordered them to be brought into his presence. The seneschal ushered them in, and at once they began to insult and upbraid the prelate, and he, on his side, answered them sharply and proudly. They demanded, in the king's name, that he should return to France. He replied that nothing would induce him to do so. So the storm of words went on, and at last the 4 knights rushed impatiently out, calling on their followers to arm, and to close the doors of the palace so that none of the townspeople could enter. They had determined to kill the archbishop, and they knew that if any of the citizens of Canterbury got the least idea of what they were about to do, they would crowd in and rescue him. Meanwhile, Becket's handful of faithful friends entreated him to seek safety in the cathedral, for in those days people had such reverence for churches that it seemed to them impossible that anyone could be wicked enough to commit an act of violence there. Becket did not want to go. He believed that he was in the right, and he did not want to appear as if he were afraid. But his friends were so impressed with the danger he was in that they took hold of his cassock and half pushed, half pulled him along the cloisters, one of his clerks, whose name was Henry of Auxerre, going before him bearing aloft the staff with a cross on the end of it, which was always carried before the primate. Can you picture the sad, disorderly little procession, the cross-bearer in front, the group of terrified clergy behind, forcing along their unwilling master, the only man who was not afraid? As they reached this low door which leads to the cathedral, the sound of hurrying footsteps is heard. The 4 knights have armed themselves and are running around the other side of the cloisters, trying to catch the archbishop before he can enter the church. But they are too late. Becket's friends have got him safely inside the little transept, and are turning around to bar the door behind them. But the archbishop would not have it so, and we cannot help admiring his splendid bravery. God's house was meant to be always open, so that whoever will can enter, and he would not have its doors shut for him. He had begun to climb the steps into the choir, but when he heard the iron bars being fastened, he turned back and undid them with his own hands. "Away, ye cowards! I command ye not to shut the door," he thundered. "The church must not be made into a castle." So the door was left open, and the knights rushed in. And here, just where this tiny stone at our feet marks the spot, the archbishop was struck down and killed. It was a wild and wicked deed, and no sooner was it done than it was repented of. But no repentance could undo it. And what weighed more heavily than anything else on the murderers' minds was the awful thought that they had killed a priest, one of God's ministers, in the very courts of God's house, the place of all others where they should have been careful of their actions. With hushed voices and trembling limbs, they stole out of the building into the midst of a fearful thunderstorm, which broke just then in all its fury over the little city, and as they passed in haste along the narrow streets, and mounting their horses, rode away into the darkness, I think they must have felt like Cain, for they must have known that ever afterwards they would be marked men. For no matter what the archbishop's faults had been, the whole of Christendom would regard the deed with shuddering horror, because it had been committed within the walls of a church of God. Meanwhile, in the cathedral, the poor monks had fastened the doors and put out the lights, and hidden themselves away in dark corners, too dumbfounded and terrified even to venture near the dead man's body. So here it lay, unheeded on the stone floor, till far on in the night, when the monks gathered courage, and came out of their hiding places, and lifting it reverently, laid it on a bier before the high altar. Next morning they buried it hurriedly and by stealth in the crypt, for they had heard a rumor that they would not be allowed to bury it in the cathedral, where so many other archbishops rested. But it only remained in the crypt some 50 years, for the story of that dark night's work soon spread through the length and breadth of the land, and all over Europe, and even to Rome itself. And everybody was so horrified at the thought of an archbishop being murdered in his own cathedral that they forgot Becket's faults, and only remembered that he died in defense of what he thought were the rights of the church. And they spoke of him as a martyr and a saint, and insisted that his body should be taken from its grave in the crypt and placed in a magnificent shrine which stood in this empty space which we see if we ascend these steps near the high altar, and passing behind it enter Trinity Chapel. Look how worn and uneven these steps are, almost as if they had been fretted away by running water. Do you know why they are fretted away like that? because thousands of men and women, pilgrims from all parts of Europe, from England and Ireland, Scotland and France, Spain and Italy, once climbed up them on their knees on their way to visit the shrine of St. Thomas of Canterbury. For no shrine in the world was more famous, and none was richer in ornaments, and it was from these pilgrims that the steps take their name of Pilgrims' Steps. Have you ever heard of Geoffrey Chaucer's Canterbury Tales? It is an old book, written in curious verse and quaint old-world English, and if you opened it, perhaps you would not think it looked very interesting. But it tells you of a company of pilgrims who set out from London one April morning to make a pilgrimage to Becket's shrine in Canterbury. There were 29 of them, and some of them were rich and some were poor, some were knights and barons and some were nuns. One was a learned scholar from Oxford, and one was a poor, unlearned cook. And they all told stories by the way, and they all came into the great cathedral and prayed at the shrine, and they slept at a little inn, the Chequers of the Hope. You can see it still at the corner of the lane which leads from the cathedral precincts to the High Street. And then they all travelled back to London again. They were only people in Chaucer's imagination, of course, but to read about them gives us a very good idea of the companies of pilgrims with whom the streets of the little city would be crowded in the Middle Ages. For 300 years this state of things went on, and the shrine grew more and more famous, and ever richer and more magnificent, as kings and princes and nobles came to pray at it, and to leave their offerings of gold or silver or jewels. Then came the beginning of the Reformation, and Henry VIII's quarrel with the Pope. In his name, orders were given that all the great shrines were to be destroyed, and the gold and jewels with which they were adorned put in the king's treasury. So the gorgeous shrine at Canterbury was broken to pieces, and the bones of Becket were either destroyed or thrown into some unknown grave, for no one knows today where they are lying. Before we leave the story of Becket and turn to that of the Black Prince, whose tomb we see close beside the spot where the famous shrine stood, let us go down to the crypt and look at a stone slab in the floor which marks the spot where Becket's body was buried for the first 50 years after his death. It also marks the spot where one of the most extraordinary scenes in English history took place. We have seen how Becket helped to make Henry II King of England, and what friends the two young men were at first, before Henry insisted on making Thomas Archbishop. We have seen, too, how Henry's words, spoken in haste in France, were the cause of Becket's death. Well, no sooner was the Archbishop dead than the king was seized with terrible remorse. It seemed to him that he was just as guilty of the rash deed as if he had struck down the primate with his own sword. And to add to his distress, serious troubles began to fall on his kingdom. While he was engaged in war with France, the people at home rose in rebellion. The Scots invaded the northern counties, and to make matters worse, a stormy and inclement winter brought the country to the verge of starvation. The common people, in their ignorance and superstition, said, as the thunder crashed and the wind roared, that it was the blood of St. Thomas crying to God for vengeance. And the king, almost beside himself with remorse and perplexity, came to the conclusion that the only thing he could do to obtain mercy from God for his distressed country and forgiveness for his own sin was to do penance after the custom of the time, and humble himself before God and man on the very spot where the archbishop was buried. So he hurried home from France, and one rainy July day the people of Canterbury, trembling with awe and wonder, saw their king walk barefoot through the muddy streets with nothing on but a long woolen shirt, the dress of a penitent pilgrim, and a cloak thrown over it to keep off the rain, attended by a train of bishops and monks. Into the cathedral the strange procession went, up the aisle and down into the crypt. Then, throwing off his cloak and kneeling at the archbishop's grave, Henry solemnly confessed his sin, owning that it was his hasty words that had led to the murder, and expressing his deep sorrow for them. after which he allowed each of the bishops present to give him 5 strokes with the rod, and each of the monks, there were 80 of them, to give him 3 strokes. Then, the ordeal being over, he spent the night in the dark crypt alone, leaning, we are told, against one of these stone pillars. So ended this sad story of broken friendship, and pride, and angry words, and violent death. There were faults on both sides, as we say, and because Becket was the one who suffered most, he had the sympathy of the people, and his name was held in honour. But we must not forget that although the way in which the king acknowledged his sin, and tried to make amends for it, seems strange and unnatural to us, yet to him and to the people of his day it was the sign of his deep repentance, and he did not shrink from it, as too many of us might have done. Now let us turn to the story of the Black Prince, which is so much brighter and more hopeful than that of Becket. You know a great deal about this prince from your history books, but somehow he seems more real to us when we stand beside his grave at Canterbury, and see the very armour he wore when he rode to battle. He was the eldest son of King Edward III. And gentle Philippa of Hainault, who, as you may have heard, were married in York Minster. He spent his school days at Queen's College, Oxford, and when he was still a boy he became a soldier. When he was only 16, he went with his father to fight in France, and after King Edward had ravaged the whole country to the very gates of Paris, he was retreating with his forces in the direction of Flanders, when the French king, Philip, with an immense army, came up to him and offered instant battle. The English had encamped near the forest of Crécy, which gave its name to the fight. I need not describe the battle to you. You know about it as well or better than I do. How the king did not fight at all, but went up to the top of a windmill which stood on a hill near by, and remained there watching how things went on, leaving the boy prince in his black armour to direct the soldiers, and how, when the lad was in danger, and some of the English nobles indignant, perhaps at what seemed to them his father's carelessness, spurred their horses up to the windmill and called out to the king that his son was in peril, he answered, "Let the child win his spurs, and let the day be his." You know also how the child did win his spurs, and gained the day, helped by the fact that a terrific thunderstorm came on, and the Italian bowmen, who had been fighting for the French, allowed their bowstrings to get so wet that they could not draw them, while the English archers, who were more accustomed to storms and carried their bows in cases, kept their bowstrings dry, and afterwards used them with deadly effect. No wonder that after that day the English nation worshipped their brave young prince. But besides being brave, he was gentle and courteous, a true knight. 10 years passed away, and once more he was leading an English army at Poitiers in France. The odds were terribly against him. He had 8,000 men. King John of France had 60,000. But as the English army was surrounded, he must either fight or surrender. "God is my help," said the dauntless prince, when he saw the number of his enemies. "I must fight them as best I can." And fight them he did, and conquered them, and the French king fell a prisoner into his hands. Do you remember how he treated him? He had a banquet prepared for him in his own tent, and stood behind his chair and waited on him himself. And when the French king would have remonstrated, and said that it was not fitting that he, the vanquished, should be waited on by his conqueror, he pointed out that the French monarch was a king, while he had not as yet attained that dignity, but was only a subject, and therefore must show reverence to his superiors. And you remember also that, when they appeared together in the streets of London, and the curious citizens thronged out to meet them, ready to jeer at the unfortunate king who had lost his kingdom, and to cheer their own prince who had gained it, they were rebuked and silenced, and taught a lesson of generosity and courtesy by the sight of the vanquished monarch riding in the place of honour on a fine white charger, while by his side, dressed in plain clothes, on a little black palfrey, rode the young man who had conquered him. The king and the prince had landed at Sandwich, and on their way up to London they had stayed for a night at Canterbury, and had visited the shrine of Thomas à Becket. We do not know if the prince had ever been in the little Kentish town before, but it appears that on this visit he was greatly delighted with the beauty of its cathedral, and he made up his mind that when he died he would be buried there. 6 years after this, he fell in love with his cousin Joan, who was so beautiful that she was called the Fair Maid of Kent. But because she was his cousin, there was some trouble about his marrying her, and when at last he was allowed to do so, he was so glad that he founded, as a thank-offering, a beautiful little chapel or chantry down in the crypt of Canterbury Cathedral. Other 16 years passed, and the prince lay dying in the palace of Westminster. We have seen what a brave and courteous gentleman he was, and the way in which he met death shows us that he was a fearless Christian as well. When he knew that he was dying, he made his will. We can still read it, written in Old World French. In it he commits his soul to God, and directs that his body should be taken to Canterbury and buried in the chapel that he had founded in the crypt. He also gave orders that his tomb was to be decorated by his crest, 3 ostrich feathers, and his arms, and on them were to be inscribed his mottos, Humant and Ish Deen. Further, that round his tomb an inscription was to be written clearly, so that all men might read it, telling how little the grandeur and pomp and success of this life matters when the time comes for a man to die. He died the day after he had made this will, on Trinity Sunday, 1376. His commands were obeyed, in part at least, for in the midst of great mourning his body was taken to Canterbury, but people felt somehow that it was not fitting that this great and chivalrous and well-beloved prince should be buried down in the dark crypt, so they laid him here in Trinity Chapel, close to the shrine of Becket. Look, they have placed his effigy above his tomb, so that all coming generations might know what manner of man he was. There he lies, in full armour, his head resting on his helmet, his feet with the likeness of the spurs he won at Crécy, his hands joined in the last prayer he offered up on his deathbed, the prayer in which he asked forgiveness for himself and his enemies. Over him hangs a wooden canopy, on which is painted a curious representation of the Holy Trinity, and above all, fastened to the beam from which the canopy is hung, are the things which I think will interest you most of all, and which he himself desired should hang above his tomb. There is his helmet, and his jointed gauntlets, his shield and surcoat, tarnished and faded now, but once ablaze with the golden leopards of England and the fleur-de-lis of France, and his sword scabbard, which once contained his sword, which, it is said, was carried away by Oliver Cromwell. Then, before we turn away, let us bring our eyes down to the tomb once more, and notice the ostrich feathers carved around it, the Prince of Wales feathers, which we know so well, for they have been borne as a crest by the heir to the throne of England ever since the days of the Black Prince. Let us also look at the mottos woven around them, Humant, or Hoc Muth, High Spirits, and Ishdeen, I serve. Do they not tell us the secret of the wonderful influence which this prince, who died so long ago, wielded? He served, but he served nobly, willingly, with the high and generous spirit and the kindly tact of a good man. I think the service which he rendered to all who were round about him, whether they were his friends or whether they were his foes, was the service which St. Paul meant when he said, "Whatsoever ye do, do it heartily, as to the Lord, and not to men." If we tried to look at all the tombs in this grand cathedral, and to recall the stories of all those who lie buried in them, we might spend days here, and unluckily we have not time to do that. But before we leave it, let us go down to the crypt once more, for although it is so quiet and solemn, I think the crypt is quite as interesting as the cathedral above. You remember how I told you that the prince had had some trouble over his marriage, and how, when it was safely accomplished, he founded a chapel, or chantry, here as a thank-offering. We see this chapel on our left-hand side as we enter. "But," you say in astonishment, "it looks as if people worshipped in it today. Here is a pulpit, and there are chairs and books." Yes, people do worship in it today, and that is one of the glories of Canterbury Cathedral. It is the mother cathedral of England, and in it, for over 1,000 years, the stately ritual of the national church has been carried on. But it was big enough and generous enough to spare a little corner of its crypt as a refuge to a congregation of strangers and foreigners who came to this country when they could not worship God in their own way with safety in their own native land. You have read about the Huguenots, the Protestants of France and Flanders, who were so persecuted in the 16th century that they fled abroad for safety. Many of them went to Switzerland and Germany, and many of them came to England. They were mostly cloth or silk weavers, and it was a very good thing for England that they did come, for they brought the knowledge of their craft with them and taught it to English people. A colony of them settled at Canterbury, and as they could only speak French, and had neither church nor workshops, and as their manner of worship was different from that of the English, Queen Elizabeth said that they could have the crypt of the cathedral to work in on weekdays, and to have service in on Sundays. So they set up their looms here, and worked at them until they had earned enough money to take workrooms elsewhere, and they took possession of the Black Prince's chantry, and used it as their church. And though they only wove in the crypt for a short time, they worshipped here always, and their descendants worshipped here after them. And even now, every Sunday, a French service is held, after the manner of the Huguenots, in this little chapel. End of section 2. Section 3 of Tales of English Minsters, Canterbury Cathedral, Kent, and St. Paul's Cathedral, London, by Elizabeth Wilson Grierson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Section 3, St. Paul's Cathedral, London, Part 1. St. Paul's Cathedral, the Church of the Citizens. 1. I am sure that there is no one who goes to London for the first time, no matter how hurried he may be, who does not try to visit at least 3 places: the Tower, Westminster Abbey, and St. Paul's Cathedral. Of these 3 places, 2 are churches, but they are churches that are so connected with the history of our nation that they almost seem to stand at the heart of the empire. Their stories are linked together in a curious way, and yet they are quite distinct. As someone has said, Westminster Abbey was ever the church of the king and government. St. Paul's was the church of the citizens. When we come to study the history of cathedrals, we find the way in which they came to be built is pretty much the same in most cases. A little church was raised to the glory of God, and a monastery was founded beside it, which became the home of a community of monks or nuns, ruled over by an abbot or abbess, and the church was known as the Abbey Church. Then, by and by, sometimes not till quite late, as at St. Albans, a bishop's stool was placed there, and the abbey became a cathedral. But in the case of St. Paul's Cathedral, it is quite different. It was built for a cathedral from the first. Its builder, instead of adding a monastery to it, as was usually done, built a monastery having its own abbey on a little island, which stood in some marshy ground on the banks of the Thames, about a mile away. This island was called Thorney Island, and the Abbey Church was dedicated to St. Peter, but soon it began to be spoken of as the Westminster or Westminster Abbey, by which name we know it today. This is how it all came about. In the time of the early Britons, there were Christian churches scattered up and down the land, and it is almost certain, from stones that were dug up when the foundations of the present Cathedral of St. Paul were being laid, that in those far bygone days a little church stood on the hill of Ludgate in the center of Roman London. But as you know, the Roman legions were recalled to Rome in A.D. 410 to help the soldiers there to drive back the vast hordes of Goths and barbarians who were pouring down from the northwest upon Italy, And when they were withdrawn from Britain, there were not enough fighting men left to protect her shores from the next enemies who threatened her. These were the Jutes, the Angles, and the Saxons, fierce and heathen warriors who came from Jutland and from Germany and landed on our coasts. They conquered the British and rapidly forced their way inland, ravaging and pillaging wherever they went, and in the confusion and misery that followed, Christianity was completely swept away for a time, to come again with St. Augustine and St. Columba some 200 years later. You know, too, perhaps, that when St. Augustine came to Canterbury and began to preach the gospel there, the King of Kent, Ethelbert by name, soon became a Christian. This King Ethelbert was a very powerful monarch, and he was overlord of the King of the East Saxons, who chanced to be his nephew, and who lived in what we now call Essex. Now, while St. Augustine preached to the men of Kent, a friend of his, named Mellitus, preached to the East Saxons, and when at last their king became a Christian, his uncle Ethelbert suggested that, as Kent had its Bishop of Canterbury with his cathedral church, it would be a good thing for the kingdom of the East Saxons to have a bishop of its own who would have his cathedral church also. So, as London was the capital of the East Saxons, he proposed to help King Siebert to build a church there, and Augustine, only too glad to find that the faith was spreading, said that Mellitus should be its first bishop. It was in this way that the first cathedral of St. Paul was built, and, as we have seen, Siebert also founded the church and monastery of Westminster. Now, although their king had been baptized and had built 2 churches in their midst, the people of London did not want to become Christians. They were pagans and were quite content to worship Thor and Odin, the gods of the tribes of the north. So for a long time the good Bishop Mellitus preached to them in vain. And far away in Rome, Pope Gregory, who had hoped that the new cathedral in London would become what we call the Metropolitan Church of England, that is, the church where the Archbishop has his throne, was sadly disappointed, and had to become accustomed to the idea of Canterbury, which was a far less important place than London having that honour. Indeed, for a time it seemed as though, in spite of church and bishops, the new religion would be driven out. Ethelbert died, and so did his nephew Siebert, and the kings who succeeded them either went back altogether to their pagan worship, or tried, as an East Anglian king did, to worship Thor and Odin and Christ all at the same time. I will tell you just one story about those troubled days, and it will show you what a terrible struggle went on between paganism and Christianity, and how much we owe to these brave men, priests and abbots and bishops, whose names are almost unknown to us, on whom rested the responsibility of maintaining the faith in England, and of whom, to their honour be it said, hardly one failed. One day Bishop Mellitus was administering the Holy Communion in his church to the little congregation of Christians who still remained true to what he had taught them. It is probable that the altar stood then just where the high altar in St. Paul's stands today. Only the church would be much smaller and plainer, and the door would be locked to prevent unbelieving pagans entering and disturbing the service by irreverent jeering and laughter. Suddenly a loud knocking was heard, then the crash of falling wood. The young king and his friends had chanced to be passing, and, in a moment of heedless excitement, had determined to visit the Christians' church and see what amusement they could get there. Angry at finding the door locked against them, they had broken it down without further delay. Up the aisle strode the king, followed by his mocking companions, to where the old bishop was engaged in distributing the consecrated bread to the kneeling communicants. In those days white bread was a rarity, most of it being dark-colored and unwholesome, and this white bread that was used for the Holy Communion was the whitest and purest of all. For in order that it should be so, pious people, even the clergy themselves, used to grind the meal carefully with their own hands, and bake it into loaves, bring it to church as their offering. "Give me some of that white bread," cried the young king, stretching out his hand. "You gave it to my father Siebert, give it also to me." Perhaps he thought in his reckless insolence that the bishop would obey. But King Siebert had been baptized Christian, his son was a pagan and an unbeliever. So, king though he was, he could not be allowed to join with the Christians in their solemn feast. And the brave old bishop told him so, knowing full well that the refusal might cost him his life. The young king did not put him to death, however, though he was very angry. Perhaps he was ashamed to do so. But it cost him his bishopric, for he was driven out of the kingdom and had to leave to seeming ruin all the work that was so dear to his heart. But it was only seeming ruin. He had done his work faithfully, he had laid the foundations, as it were, and, as has ever happened in the history of the Church, God saw to it that there were other men ready to step in and build upon these foundations. Other bishops were appointed, Bishop Cedd and Bishop Erkenwald, and in their days the Christian faith began to take root and spread among the citizens of London, and they improved and beautified their cathedral until it became famed for its riches and grandeur. Indeed, Bishop Erkenwald was such a famous preacher and did so much for his church that when he died he was buried in a golden shrine which people came to see, just as they visited the shrine of St. Cuthbert at Durham and St. Thomas at Canterbury. As for stout old Bishop Mellitus, although he was driven into exile for a time, he became in after years Archbishop of Canterbury, and his bones lie in the cathedral there. Now, it is a curious thing how often those old churches that we are talking about were destroyed, either wholly or in part, by fire. And if there was one church that was fated to suffer more than another in this way, it was St. Paul's. It was partly burned down in A.D. 951. By that time the Normans were in the country, and they set to work at once to rebuild it. When it was finished, it was a very splendid church indeed, but once more it suffered severely from a fire which broke out in the city and destroyed everything from London Bridge to the church of St. Clement Danes, which stands in the Strand. Let us see what this cathedral of the Middle Ages was like. It was the largest church in England, and was shaped like a cross, and instead of having a dome, as the present cathedral has, it had a great square tower in the center, with a wooden spire 460 feet high. It stood in the middle of a churchyard, which was surrounded by a high wall. We still talk about St. Paul's churchyard, although it is long years since anyone was buried there. But if we are in London and take a bus along the crowded Strand and up Ludgate Hill, we shall arrive at this old churchyard, and then we shall see the St. Paul's of today, and shall be better able to picture to ourselves the St. Paul's of the Middle Ages. When we leave our bus, we find ourselves in an open space, bounded on all sides by busy streets and fine shops. In the center of this open space stands an immense church with a huge dome rising from its center, and on the top of the dome, standing clearly out against the sky, so far up that it can be seen from nearly all parts of London, is an immense gilded cross. In front of the church there are two great flights of steps, which lead down into a broad paved space, only separated from the street by a row of low stone pillars, while round at the sides lie pleasant gardens with flagged walks where pigeons flutter about, and where in summer hundreds of busy clerks and shop-girls and message-boys come and sit in their lunch hour and get a breath of fresh air and a little sunshine. But where is the old churchyard, you ask, looking round in amazement? I will tell you. These gardens and the great space in front of the church stand today where St. Paul's churchyard stood long ago, only there is no longer a wall around them, and although the name remains, the gravestones have long since disappeared. Let us try, however, to think that we are back in the Middle Ages, and imagine ourselves standing among the graves in the old churchyard. In front would be the great church, bigger than that which now rises before us, with its square tower and wooden steeple. At the northeast corner of it we would see a curious erection like a low 8-sided tower with a stone cross on the top of it. That was called Paul's Cross, and it was almost as important a place as the cathedral itself. As I said at the beginning, St. Paul's Church was the church of the citizens. The monarchs of the land might be crowned or buried at Westminster, but it was to St. Paul's that the people crowded when they wanted to meet together and stand up for their rights. So there was a great bell in the cathedral belfry, like the bell in St. Giles Cathedral in Edinburgh, which was rung whenever a question arose which concerned the burghers of the city, and when its deep tones were heard, the people ran out of their houses and thronged into the churchyard through the 6 gates which pierced its encircling wall, and crowded around Paul's cross, and the aldermen, ascending by steps to the top of the 8-sided tower, stood near the cross and spoke to them. Here royal proclamations were made, quarrels were settled, grievances stated, and put to rights. Here also sermons were preached in the open air by famous preachers. Indeed, I think that I may safely say that Paul's Cross was the centre of the public life of London. It has long since been pulled down, however, but if we go to the northwest corner of the gardens, we can still see the place where it stood, clearly marked on the pavement. The bishop's palace also stood within the wall, and 2 little churches, one of which was founded by Gilbert à Becket, father of Thomas of Canterbury, who was a silk mercer in Cheapside, while the other was a parish church, the Church of St. Faith, which was pulled down in after years, and the people who went to service there were allowed to worship in the crypt of the cathedral instead. It would only weary you to attempt to describe the interior of the old church. It would be very like the other cathedrals of that time, which were all more richly adorned before the Reformation than they are now. All the accounts which we read of it show us that it was very magnificent, with rich carvings and stained glass, and no less than 70 side chapels and chantries, each with its own altar, and richer than all others, the great shrine of St. Erkenwald with its ornaments and jewels. I think that it will be much more interesting to talk of some of the scenes that took place there in these far-off days. Let us go back, for instance, almost 800 years, to the day when the news arrived in London that the King of England, Henry I, lay dead in France. He and his brother, William Rufus, were, as you know, sons of the great Norman conqueror, and during their reigns the country had been well governed and prosperous. But when Henry died, no one quite knew what to do next, for the rightful heir to the throne was Henry's daughter Maud, who had married a French Count of Anjou, who, as you remember, was the first of his race to be called Plantagenet, because he was in the habit, as he rode along, of plucking a piece of broom, planta genista, and sticking it in the front of his cap. Now, the English people did not love this Geoffrey of Anjou, who was a greedy and selfish man, and they had no wish to have him for their king, as they would certainly have to do if his wife became queen. So their thoughts turned to Maud's cousin, Count Stephen of Blois, who, although his father was a Frenchman, had an English mother, and who had been brought up in England at his uncle's court. Most people wished to have him as their king, but no one dare suggest it until the citizens of London took matters into their own hands. The country needed a monarch, they said, and if the barons would not take the responsibility of electing one, they would. And without more ado, the Portreeve, or Lord Mayor, and aldermen caused the great bell of St. Paul's to be rung, summoning the burghers to a folkmote, or council. And when they had all gathered around the cross in the churchyard, the matter was discussed, and it was agreed that it would be better for England that Stephen should be king rather than that Maud should be queen. And straightway the city gates were thrown open to the Count, and the citizens swore allegiance to him, and he was crowned King of England. Perhaps, after all, it would have been better if the citizens had chosen Maud, for, as history shows, Stephen did not turn out to be a very good king. Another great decision that was made at a public meeting at St. Paul's was the framing of Magna Charta, the Great Charter which secured for all time to come justice and liberty to English freemen. In these old days, especially after the Normans came into the country, kings were apt to think that might was right, and that they could do what they chose with their subjects. If a man displeased the king, or if he wanted to seize his land, he could simply throw him into prison and keep him there, sometimes until he died, without giving him even a trial. Then, too, if the monarch wanted money, he simply forced the people to give it to him, and no one had any security that what was his today might not be the king's tomorrow. When Henry I came to the throne, he wanted to please the people because he had an elder brother living who had gone to the Crusades, and he was afraid that unless he gained the affection of his subjects before his brother came back, they might choose the latter to be king instead of him. So he granted them a charter, promising not to seize any of their property, nor to tax them unduly, nor to touch any of the lands belonging to the Church. He did not keep those promises very well, however, and his successors, Stephen and Henry and Richard and John, did not keep them at all. And by the middle of King John's reign, the country was in a very bad state indeed. No heed was given to the advice or wishes of the great nobles, who ought to have had a voice in the government of the country, while the common people were so oppressed and downtrodden that they were ready to rise in rebellion, and they would have done so if it had not been for the wisdom and prudence of two great men, Stephen Langton, Archbishop of Canterbury, and William Marshal, eldest son of the Earl of Pembroke. Stephen Langton was a foreigner whom the Pope had sent to Canterbury, but he was a good man, a real father in God to his people, and he believed that he was set over them to look after their bodies as well as their souls. When he found out how downtrodden the poor folk of England were, he made up his mind that such a state of things should not continue. So he began to inquire into the laws, and he found out about this old charter, which had been granted by Henry I, but had never been kept, and had long since been forgotten. The wise archbishop did not say anything, but he quietly set to work to find a copy of this charter. After some trouble, he discovered one hidden away among the papers of an old monastery. He then summoned all the chief people in the country to meet him at St. Paul's Cathedral. That was one of the most memorable assemblies in English history. All the powerful nobles and barons, all the stately bishops and priors, all the sober aldermen of the great city, met together and listened with deep interest while the archbishop read aloud to them the promises which had been made by Henry I and recorded on the parchment which he held in his hand. Then pointed out to them that these promises had never been kept, and that the people of England had a right to demand that they should be kept. He finished his speech by calling upon his listeners to band themselves together and never rest satisfied till they had obtained redress from the grievous wrongs which had pressed upon them and upon their poorer brethren. The archbishop's words were not in vain. Nobles and barons crowded round him, and laying their hands upon their swords, took a solemn oath that they would insist upon the principles of Henry's charter being maintained, and would do their best to protect the liberties of the people. This was just before Christmas time, and when the king came to hold his Christmas court in London, these same nobles, armed to the teeth, and accompanied by the churchmen and the principal citizens, appeared before him and demanded that he should listen to their requests and make proper laws to guard their liberties. King John was frightened, but he did not want to give in. So, like the weak man that he was, he did not return a direct answer, but said that he would think over the matter and meet them again at Easter. He thought that in this way he could put them off, and never give them an answer at all. But the people were determined, and formed themselves into an army which they called the Army of God and of Holy Church, and all the clergy and all the citizens of London and Exeter and Lincoln supported them, and the king was obliged to yield. So it came about that one June day a great assembly of people met on the banks of the Thames near Windsor. On one side was encamped the king, with a handful of followers, and on the other the great army of barons and nobles and citizens had pitched their tents on a piece of marshy land known by the name of Runnymede. In the middle of the river was a small island, and on this island a few men chosen by the king, and a few men chosen by the nobles, met to discuss matters. At least they pretended to discuss matters, for every one knew what the end would be. The king was powerless to resist the wishes of the great concourse of people gathered across the river, and before nightfall Magna Charta, the Great Charter, had been drawn up and signed. I cannot tell you all the good things that were secured to Englishmen by this great deed, but there was one thing which above all others it gained for them, and gained for us as well: justice. It is one of our proudest boasts that by English law no man, be he ever so poor or degraded, is condemned unheard; that every man is counted innocent till by a fair trial he is proved to be guilty; and the very foundation of our freedom rests on some words that were written that day on that old parchment: "We will sell to no man, we will not delay nor deny to any man justice or right." But if the great bell of St. Paul's could call the citizens to fight for their liberty as Englishmen against the oppression of the king, it could also summon them to fight for their liberty as churchmen against the oppression of the Pope. We must always remember that when first Christianity was brought to England in the time of the Romans, and the ancient British Church was formed, it did not owe allegiance to the bishops of Rome as it did in later days. It was only after it had been swept away by the invasion of the Angles and Saxons, and then brought back again to the south of England by St. Augustine, who came direct from Pope Gregory of Rome, that the belief arose that it was right that the Church of England should be ruled by the Pope. Up in the north, on the other hand, in Scotland and in Northumbria, where Christianity had been brought by St. Columba and his followers, who, as you remember, came from Ireland, it was a very much longer time before the Church would admit the papal claims, although at last it did so. And St. Aidan and St. Cuthbert, who founded the Northumbrian Church, being missionaries from the ancient British Church, which St. Columba represented, did not feel obliged to obey the Pope in the same way that St. Augustine did. It would take me too long to tell you about the differences that existed between the Church in the north and that in the south, the chief of which was that they did not keep the festival of Easter on the same day. The Church of St. Augustine, following the example of Rome, kept it on one day. The Church of St. Columba, following the example of the British and Eastern churches, observed it some 10 days later, as the Russians and Greeks still do. But as time went on, the rule of the Pope began to weigh heavily upon the English people. They thought that they had the right to elect their own bishops and archbishops, while the Pope thought that he had the right to do so, and at first he very often sent foreigners to fill the English sees. Sometimes, indeed very often, they were good men. The saintly Bishop Hugh of Lincoln came from Savoy. Archbishop Theodore of Canterbury was a Greek who came from faraway Tarsus, the city of St. Paul. But some of them were bad men, haughty and insolent, who wanted to override English laws and English freedom. And when this happened, the people were apt to rebel, and declare that only English bishops should rule in the Church of England. Things came to a crisis when, in the 13th century, a great many Italians came over to England and were given some of the highest offices in the country. Among them were two brothers of good birth, Peter of Savoy and his brother Boniface. Peter, who had a grand house on the Strand, called Savoy House, was made a privy councillor, and was given the chief seat at the king's council board. Boniface, who was a priest, was, by the wish of the Pope, made Archbishop of Canterbury. Now Boniface of Savoy had mistaken his vocation. He was young and handsome and full of roistering spirits. He would have made a good soldier, and doubtless his men would have admired him for his reckless daring. But he was haughty and insolent and overbearing, and sadly lacking in common sense, not fit to be placed in the great position in which he found himself. He brought with him a band of armed retainers, who, when they rode through the streets of London, robbed the stalls in the market-places as though they had been wild marauders instead of the servants of a Christian bishop. Their master behaved no better than they did. There was in the city a monastery called St. Bartholomew's in Smithfield. He resolved to visit it, and, appearing at the gate with his men, demanded an entrance. For some reason the prior resented this, Perhaps Boniface's insolent manner made him angry. Perhaps he felt that it was the Bishop of London's place to inspect his monastery, and not the Archbishop of Canterbury's. At any rate, he refused to admit the prelate. And what do you think happened? Without more ado, the Archbishop clenched his fist and knocked the prior to the ground. It was a foolish as well as a wicked act, for of course the news of what had been done spread through London, and the citizens began to say to each other that a man who could do a deed like that was not fit to be an archbishop. A little time afterwards, Boniface determined to visit St. Paul's Cathedral and call upon the Bishop of London for his tithes or first fruits. He may have been acting quite within his rights to do this, I do not know, but the citizens, at any rate, made up their minds that if he came with his demands to their cathedral church, he would find out what they thought of him. So the big bell was rung, and they gathered around the cross in their thousands. Archbishop Boniface heard of this in his palace at Lambeth, and although he would not be turned from his purpose, he put on a suit of armour under his robes before he ventured near the cathedral. When he arrived there, he found, to his rage, that the citizens had closed the gates against him, and instead of being awed by his angry remonstrances, they jeered and hooted at him, and even threatened him with violence, so that at last he thought it wise to go home. But worse was to follow. Now that an Italian archbishop sat on the throne of Canterbury, a great many Italian priests came over, and were given the best livings in the church. Their manners were no better than those of their countrymen, and the citizens became so enraged at the behavior of these foreigners, and at the unjust way in which the Pope had forced them upon them, that they determined that not one of them should set foot in the church that they looked on as especially their own. And they were in such deadly earnest that it actually came about that when two of these priests attempted to enter the precincts one day, the people crowded into the churchyard and killed them on the spot. After this they rushed to Lambeth and besieged the palace there, uttering such threats that Boniface, the handsome archbishop as they called him, was glad to escape as best he could, and fly abroad for safety. He never came back, and we can fancy that the Pope was more careful in future whom he sent to England, for the citizens of London had taught him a lesson, and shown him that he could not lord it over them with impunity. Just one more story about these old days, and then we must come to the St. Paul's that we know. It was in the reign of King Edward III, and the Church of England had lost its first purity, and grown rich and corrupt. Many of the bishops and clergy had forgotten what they had been made ministers of God for, and instead of thinking about the deeds of their people, they thought only of how much wealth they could heap up for themselves, and how luxuriously they could live. End of section 3. Section 4 of Tales of English Minsters, Canterbury Cathedral, Kent, and St. Paul's Cathedral, London, by Elizabeth Wilson Grierson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Section 4, St. Paul's Cathedral, London, Part 2. The Reformation was yet a long way off, but there were two men in the country who wanted to put an end to this state of affairs, and they wanted to do so for two very good reasons. You have all heard of John Wycliffe, the earliest of the English reformers. He was one of those two men, and he wanted to weaken the power of Rome, because he saw that the poor people of this country were being robbed in order to enrich the Pope and his favorites, who, as we have seen, were put into high places in the Church. So he began to point out the abuses that existed, and to urge people not to submit to them any longer. The other man was a powerful noble, John of Gaunt, time-honored Lancaster, as Shakespeare calls him, and I am afraid that the reason why he wanted the power taken from the clergy was that he hoped that when they could no longer collect great sums of money from the common people, he and his brother nobles might be able to do so instead. So when, one day, Wycliffe was summoned to appear before the Bishop of London, Bishop Courtenay, to answer for the heretical notions which it was reported that he was spreading, the Duke of Lancaster espoused his cause and stood by his side. It must have been a curious scene, the grave bishop in his robes, seated on his throne, with his advisers round him, the thin, worn priest from Lutterworth, with his pale, studious face and black gown, and the proud noble who was at that time one of the most powerful men in the country. Some of the citizens had crept into the church to hear what the monk had to say, but they did not hear him say very much, for the Duke of Lancaster soon began to wrangle with the bishop. He hated the clergy because he was so envious of their position and power that they had over the simple folk, and his pride could not brook the questions that the bishop put to his friend. At last he lost his temper altogether, and after speaking very rudely to the prelate, he threatened to drag him out of the church by the hair of his head. In an instant the listening citizens sprang to their feet. They were not very interested in Wycliffe's reforms. Probably at that time they did not know very much about them. But this powerful duke was no friend of theirs, and they were enraged at the thought that he dared come into their cathedral and threaten their bishop. With one accord they rushed to the belfry and tolled the great bell, and when, as was their duty, crowds of other citizens gathered in the churchyard to see what had happened, they told them, in excited tones, that John of Gaunt was in the church with his followers, and threatened to lay hands on the bishop. Then a perfect tempest arose. Some of the crowd rushed into the church, declaring that they would murder the duke. Others went off to his palace in the Strand, determined to break into it and pillage it, in order to punish him for his insolence. And they were in such deadly earnest that they would have carried out both threats had not Bishop Courtenay himself interfered and saved his enemy from their violence. Just before the Reformation, the great church was at the very height of its glory, from an outward point of view at least. We read that there were no less than 130 clergy who were supposed to minister there, and that there were so many people connected with it, schoolmasters, schoolboys, singing men, choir boys, beadsmen, bookbinders, sextons, gardeners, bell ringers, etc., that employment must have been given to more than 1,000 people. It all seems very grand and glorious, but if we read further, we find that it had grown just like the temple in our Lord's time. There was a great deal of outward magnificence, and yet the very purpose that the church had been built for, the service and worship of God, was in danger of being forgotten. Instead of being kept as God's house entirely for his worship, we find that the great nave was the fashionable meeting place of the good folk of London, and they used it as we should use a promenade today. Francis Osborne, an old historian, writes, "It was the fashion in those days for the principal gentry, lords and courtiers, and men of all professions, to meet in St. Paul's by 11 of the clock, and walk in the middle aisle till 12, and after dinner from 3 till 6, during which time some discoursed of business, and others of news." Then came the Reformation, and, as always happens when a great change like that is taking place, people were so zealous to sweep away all the abuses that had crept in, that they lost their heads, as we say, and did many wrong and unseemly things. It was right and needful that the church should be reformed, but it was not right nor needful that all the splendid carving and decorated stonework and beautifully illuminated books and gold and silver altar vessels, which had been given for the service of God by pious men and women, should be broken by hammers or burned or carried away and melted down to fill the pockets of worthless noblemen. It was right that the nave should no longer be the place of resort for all the fashionable loungers in the city, but it did not improve matters when the same nave was turned into cavalry barracks for Oliver Cromwell's soldiers, and the rough men were allowed to play games and behave in any way that they liked in the church. No, the history of that time is not pleasant reading, and we feel almost glad when we hear that, first of all, the wooden spire was struck by lightning and set on fire, and then that the whole church was burned down by the great fire that devastated London in September 1666, for then a new beginning could be made, and those unhappy old stories forgotten. 2. You all know about the Great Fire of London, how it came after the plague, and how it seemed such a calamity at the time, but proved, after all, a blessing in disguise, for it burned down all the old plague-infested, unhealthy wooden houses, which were so crowded together that the streets were narrow and dark, and made room for better buildings and wider streets, and brought in a healthier mode of living altogether. Just before the fire broke out, a proposal had been made to restore the old cathedral, and a famous architect, Sir Christopher Wren, had been called in to discuss the matter. He had agreed to undertake the work, and was prepared to do so, when the great fire took place, and when it was over, there was nothing left of the church but the blackened walls. Then people shook their heads and said that it would be impossible to restore it. A new cathedral might be built somewhere else, but the St. Paul's that they had known on Ludgate Hill had gone forever. But Sir Christopher Wren differed from them. It would be impossible to restore the church, he said, or even to rebuild it on its old foundation. But there was no reason why a new foundation should not be laid and a new church built upon it. That was all very well, answered the objectors to the scheme, but how did Dr. Wren propose to take down the walls and level the old foundations? He suggested gunpowder, and with a little care he could have blown down the walls quite safely, but a stupid master builder thought that he could do the work himself without the architect superintending, and he set to work one morning and used such a big charge of the explosive that a great many of the half-ruined houses in the neighborhood fell with the force of the explosion, and people got such a fright that they objected to gunpowder being used at all. The famous architect was not dismayed, however, at this opposition. He believed in the proverb that says, "Where there's a will, there's a way." So he procured a great beam of wood 40 feet long, and had it covered at both ends with iron. Then he slung this beam up in a wooden erection, something like a triangle, and used it as a battering ram to break down the walls. At first it appeared as if it would be in vain. The workmen battered at the walls for a whole day, and not a stone fell. But Wren persevered, and the next day he was rewarded, for the great buttresses fell at last with a crash, and he was able to proceed with his work. And this he did most thoroughly. Someone has said of him that he built for eternity, and as far as any man can do so, the saying is true. Everyone knows that the security of a building depends greatly upon the kind of foundation it rests upon. No matter how well built it is, no matter how showy the walls may be, if the foundation is not firm and solid, sooner or later it must fall to pieces, unless something is done to repair it. Christopher Wren knew of this danger, and the first thing that he set his workmen to do was to dig down 40 feet into the earth to find out if the ground on which he intended to build was quite solid and secure. Doubtless many people laughed at him, and said that he was too particular, but he did not care, and they stopped laughing when it was discovered that right down at the northeast corner there was a pit, and if the new cathedral had been built over this, sooner or later the ground would have sunk, and the wall of the building have cracked, and in all probability fallen to pieces. However, Dr. Wren made his workmen dig deeper till they got to the bottom of this pit. Then he filled it up with a pier of solid stone. It took him a whole year to do this, but at the end of that time he was ready to begin the church, knowing that underneath it was a foundation that was absolutely secure. Then arose the great cathedral that we see today. It took some 30 years to build, and when it was finished, the highest stone in the lantern that rested on the dome was laid in its place by Sir Christopher Wren's son. But now we learn something about Sir Christopher that shows that he was a good as well as a clever man. Do you remember what is said in the Bible about people who can rule their own spirits and are slow to be angry? That they are really greater than the men who conquer cities and whom the world admires. Tried by this standard, Sir Christopher was a really great man, for he was not only clever enough to build St. Paul's Cathedral, but he could rule his own spirit and not vex himself over the way in which his enemies treated him. The story of Sir Christopher Wren's life, for he was knighted as a reward for his work, is as interesting as any of the stories connected with St. Paul's Cathedral. He was the son of a Wiltshire clergyman, and his love of architecture dated from a time when the roof of his father's church had grown so old that it threatened to fall down. And as often happens in a country parish, there were not very many rich men living there who could give money to pay for the building of a new one. So the vicar determined that instead of paying for an architect, he would draw the plans and superintend the building of the roof himself. And we can imagine how little Christopher would hear all about the new church roof, and how he would look over his father's shoulder and watch him when he was drawing the plans, and how he would spend all his playtime in the church looking at the joiners putting up the wooden beams and the other workmen working on the walls, while his father went up and down superintending everything, and very likely lending a helping hand himself. Perhaps it was in these early days that the boy determined that he, too, would build churches when he was grown up. Then he had an Uncle Matthew who was Bishop of Ely, and as he grew older he would go and visit him, and would wander across from the palace into Queen Ethelred's beautiful Minster church, and stand and look up in wonder at the lantern tower, and his uncle would tell him the story of how it once fell, and how Alan de Walsingham built it up again, and perhaps it was that which gave him the idea, which he carried out afterwards at St. Paul's, of a great church with an enormous dome in the center of it, under which thousands of people could assemble, as they do on Sunday afternoons at St. Paul's today, and listen to the sermon of some great preacher. He did something else first, however, for he was very fond of watching the stars, and when he went to Oxford he watched them so closely and learned so much about them that he was made professor of astronomy. But although he was made professor of astronomy, he seems to have gone on all the time studying architecture and drawing plans of churches, and at last King Charles heard of him and asked him to draw some plans of churches for him. In this way he became known as a clever architect, and when the Great Fire took place, and a large part of London had to be rebuilt, he not only built a new cathedral, but 42 other churches as well, besides which he built Marlborough House and a great part of Greenwich Hospital. So you see that he had a useful, busy life, and it was a very long one as well, for he lived till he was an old man of 91. He was not very kindly treated towards the end of his life, and this was because of what is called political jealousy. It had been the Stuart kings who had brought him into notice, and given him the post of Surveyor General. But when the House of Hanover came into power, their followers said, "Oh, we cannot have any of the friends of the Stuarts holding good posts. We must take them from them, and give them to those of our own party." And so Sir Christopher Wren's office was taken from him and given to another man, and something else was done that vexed him quite as much as losing his post. He had meant his great cathedral to stand as it stands today, with an open space all around it. Someone suggested that it would look much better if it were enclosed by a wall. And, in spite of Sir Christopher's remonstrances, a wall was built, which quite spoiled the effect in his eyes. He might have gone up and down the world trying to prove to everyone that his idea was best, and he might have made himself and his friends very unhappy over the unkindness and injustice that had been shown him. But instead of this, he only shrugged his shoulders when he looked at the unsightly wall, and said, with a little laugh, that ladies thought nothing looked well without an edging. Then he retired quietly to Hampton Court, where he had a house, and occupied himself until he died with his old hobby of astronomy, and with reading theology and philosophy. We read that occasionally the old man would give himself a treat, and do you know what the treat was? He would come to London and walk quietly up the Strand to St. Paul's churchyard, and stand and look for a while at the great and beautiful cathedral that he had built, And then he would go home, feeling quite content and happy, for he knew that it would stand for long centuries after the ugly wall had been pulled down again, and that future generations would forget all the unkind and untrue things that people had said about him, while they would always remember that it was he, Christopher Wren, who was the builder of St. Paul's. And there was something else, I think, which must have made him very happy towards the close of his life. In those days people were not above taking bribes, that is, they would take money, let us say, from a timber merchant, and promise that they would use his timber, whether it was good or bad, or from a stonemason, and use his stones, no matter how badly they were hewn. But Wren had never done this. His hands were clean, and he left such a splendid name for uprightness and honesty behind him, that after his death someone wrote of him, "In a corrupt age all testimonies leave him spotless." Now let us go inside the cathedral and walk round it, although it is so full of monuments that it is impossible to tell you the story of each. As we look at them, we realize that St. Paul's still keeps its character of the citizens' church. In Westminster Abbey, kings and poets and writers lie buried, or have monuments put up to their memory. But here, in St. Paul's, most of the monuments are those of national heroes, of men who have lived and died for the empire. We will just look at one or two. If, as we walk up the nave, we keep to our right hand, we come on the north side to a recumbent statue of bronze, and we are almost certain to find one or two people standing looking at it, and perhaps someone has laid a tiny bunch of flowers against the slab on which the figure rests. For this is the monument erected to General Gordon, and there is no man who has died in recent years whose memory is held more in honor by the people of England. For he died in the attempt to save women and children from deadly peril, and these poor people were not English, they had not even white skins, but were Sudanese who lived in far-away Khartoum. I expect that most of you have read the life of this great man, but for the sake of those who have not, I will tell you a little about him. To begin with, he was what we call unique. That is, there is no one else who is quite like him, and no one can read the story of his life without thinking of two words, hero and saint. Somehow he reminds us of a strong climber, who spends his days toiling up a great mountain and always getting higher and higher and nearer heaven, while most of us are content to remain down in the valley, where life is not so hard, but where the air is less pure and the roads are dusty. And just as we read in the old stories about heroes having one possession that kept them strong, such as a magic sword or shield or helmet, so we can clearly see one thing in General Gordon's life that made him what he was, something that enabled him to be brave and chivalrous and modest, to care absolutely nothing about praise or blame or reward or even money, the thing that so many people care so much about. And that one thing was absolute faith in God and in God's providence. Most of us live our lives as something that belongs to ourselves, and we make our own plans and choose our own careers, and we think twice before we do this or that, trying to see what the consequences of our act will be. To General Gordon, life was simply a time that was given to him to do God's will, and he was certain that whatever came to him was God's will. So it was all the same to him whether the days brought joy or sorrow, praise or blame, riches or poverty, life or death. He was a good soldier of the Queen, for Queen Victoria was living then, but he was also a good soldier of Jesus Christ, perhaps one of the best that has ever enlisted in that great army, for he took his orders and carried them out to the best of his power, never questioning, never grumbling, quite certain, whatever the consequences turned out to be, that everything was right. And it was this great faith that made him go, promptly and fearlessly, into danger that other men might have shrunk from, and with reason. He is sometimes called Chinese Gordon, because once, when there was a rebellion in China, the emperor asked for a British officer to help to quell it, and Gordon was sent. The rebels had entrenched themselves in forts, and Gordon used to lead bands of soldiers to storm these forts, carrying only a little cane in his hand, with which he pointed out to the men what he wanted them to do. And the Chinese were so amazed that they thought that the little cane was enchanted, and they called it his magic wand, and believed that it protected him from all harm. After the rebellion was quelled, he came home and was stationed at Gravesend, where he was employed in constructing forts. He might have been puffed up by the reputation that he had earned in China, and have become proud and self-conscious, but instead of that, he lived very quietly, visiting infirmaries and ragged schools in his leisure time. And he so interested himself in the poor boys whom he found in the streets that he would take them into his own house and keep them there until he found an opportunity to send them to sea, and thus give them a fresh start in life. Now comes the story of the Sudan. If you look at the map of Africa, you will see, south of Egypt, a tract of country bearing that name. I have not time to tell you how it came to be under British protection, but it did, and the natives, who had been very badly treated before, settled down to live quietly and peacefully under British rule. Then a man arose, called the Mahdi, who gathered together thousands of Arabs and raided the Sudan, vanquishing the Egyptian troops who tried to fight against them. The Mahdi became very powerful, and it was felt that it would take too many of our soldiers to hold the country against him, so the British government determined to give it up. But we could not leave all the poor Sudanese people to be massacred by the Arabs, so it was determined to try to get them safely out of the country into Egypt, and Gordon was sent out from England to do this. He was accompanied by a friend of his, Colonel Stewart, and they went to Khartoum, which, if you look at the map, you will see is the capital of the Sudan, and stands on the banks of the Nile, surrounded by deserts. They succeeded in sending 2,500 people away in safety, and then the Mahdi and his followers hemmed them in. Colonel Stewart tried to escape up the Nile and summon help from Egypt, but his boat was wrecked and he was murdered. And then Gordon was left alone, the only Englishman in Khartoum. It is very sad, and yet it is grand, to read how that lonely soldier defended the city for almost a year, with no one to help him except natives, and with a howling mob of Arabs outside the walls. He lived in what was called the palace, and day after day he used to go up to the roof and look in vain down the river and all over the desert for the help which he expected would be sent from England, and which never came. It did not come in time, at least, for it was too late in being sent, and when at last, after much danger, a relieving force did reach the city, it was only to find that it had fallen into the hands of the Arabs 2 days before, and that its brave defender, along with the rest of the inhabitants, had been killed. Can you imagine the thrill of horror and regret that swept over England when the news came home? It was felt to be such a terrible thing that one of our countrymen should have been sent out to attempt such a dangerous and difficult task, and then left alone for months fighting against such overpowering odds, and that, when at last help was sent, we should have to confess that it was sent too late. And yet, to General Gordon, facing death alone in that far-off Sudanese town, it was not terrible. It was simply a bit of God's will. Listen to the words that he wrote just 10 days before the end came, when he knew quite well that if succor did not come speedily, it need not come at all. After writing goodbye to all his friends, he adds, "I am quite happy, thank God, and like Lawrence, I have tried to do my duty." These are not the words of a man who sees death coming and is afraid. They are the words of one who was quite happy because he had done his life work as well as he could, and was content to go home to God, no matter if the way thither were very rough and very lonely. His body was never found. Probably it was hacked in pieces by the Mahdi's wild followers, and yet he had a funeral. For although Englishmen may be slow to act, they act surely. and 14 long years after Gordon's death, the Soudan was retaken, and after the great battle of Omdurman, Lord Kitchener, with his victorious army, entered Khartoum one peaceful Sunday morning, and what do you think was the first thing that he did? He took his troops, British and Egyptian, into the open space in front of the ruined palace where Gordon had fallen, and formed them into 3 sides of a square, while he and his generals stood in the center. And then, after the British and Egyptian flags had been run up to the roof of the palace, and a royal salute had been fired, a little group of clergymen stepped forward. They represented all parts of the church, for soldiers of all creeds wished to take part in Gordon's funeral. Then, while solemn minute guns were fired, a Presbyterian minister read the 17th Psalm, which tells how God's people, whenever or however they die, will behold his face in righteousness, and how they will be satisfied when they awake in his likeness. Then an English clergyman said the Lord's Prayer, and an old Roman Catholic priest with snow-white hair said a memorial prayer for Gordon and those who had fallen with him. Then the Scottish pipers wailed out a dirge, and the dark Egyptian band played Gordon's favorite hymn, "Abide with Me." After that, the soldiers were dismissed from their ranks and were at liberty to wander up and down, and everybody, down to the youngest bugler, had a glad feeling in his heart that, although they did not know the exact spot where General Gordon's bones were resting, they had done their best, after 14 years, to give him Christian burial. There are many more memorials here of men about whom we could tell the most interesting stories had we only the time. Here is a monument to Sir John Moore, who was killed at Corunna, and who, as doubtless you have learned at school, was buried darkly at dead of night before the defeated English army took to their boats. And here is one to Sir John Howard, the great prison reformer. See, he carries a key in his hand to show us how he unlocked the prison doors and brought help and comfort to the wretched inmates, far more hopeless and neglected in his day than they are in ours. And here is a representation of a bishop blessing little black children. That is Bishop Heber, first Bishop of Calcutta, who wrote a great many hymns, some of which I am sure you know. Holy, 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 Lord God Almighty, From Greenland's Icy Mountains, and Brightest and Best of the Sons of the Morning. Here is a beautiful memorial, a bronze angel stooping to lift the figure of a wounded yet crowned warrior. Let us read the inscription under it, for it tells of 43,000 men, sons of the Empire, who flocked from our colonies, from Australia, India, Ceylon, New Zealand, and South Africa, to help us to fight against the Boers, and who gave their lives for the motherland. Nearby is a great window, representing our Lord healing the sick, which was placed there as a thanksgiving for the recovery of our King from a very dangerous illness when he was Prince of Wales. Look up to the dome. Do you see the paintings there? They are so far above us that we can hardly see them properly, but if we were nearer, we should see that they are scenes from the life of St. Paul. They were painted by an artist called Sir John Thornhill, and he almost lost his life when he was painting them. Indeed, he would have done so had it not been for the promptitude of a friend of his. A great scaffold had been erected for him to stand on while he was painting, and it makes us almost giddy to think of the height that it must have been from the floor. One day he was up there working busily, and luckily a friend was with him, for he stepped back to see the effect of his work, and went so near the edge of the scaffold that another step would have taken him over, to be dashed to pieces on the floor below. His friend saw his danger, and seizing a wet paintbrush, flung it at the painting. The artist rushed forward to intercept the brush, and so his life was saved. Now let us enter the choir and look at this wonderful carving on the stalls. This was done by a famous woodcarver named Grinling Gibbons, whose story is as well worth knowing as that of Sir Christopher Wren. He was partly English and partly Dutch, and was born in Rotterdam. He was very fond of carving, and he used to copy all the things that he saw growing outside, fruits and flowers and sprays of leaves and berries, and he became a very clever carver indeed. He came to England and made up his mind to work hard at his art, and in order to have time and quietness to do so, he hired a tiny house at Deptford, and went and lived there. After he had been there some time, he determined to do a really great piece of work. He was very fond of a wonderful picture of the Crucifixion, which had been painted by a Venetian artist named Tintoretto, and he made up his mind that he would copy this in wood and frame it in a wreath of carved fruits and flowers. It was a very ambitious thing to do, but he succeeded beautifully, although it took him a long while, and cost him a great deal of time and work. Now it chanced that near his little cottage there was a great mansion called Sayes Court, in which lived a very wise, rich, and cultured man named John Evelyn. We know all about him, because he did what perhaps some of you do. He kept a diary, which has been preserved and which we can read today. And luckily for Grinling Gibbons, John Evelyn got to know him, and was a very good friend to him. If we read Evelyn's diary, we learn how it came about. He tells us how one day he was walking, by mere accident, in a field near Sayes Court, when he noticed a poor solitary thatched house. He thought he would like to see who lived there, and he went and knocked, but the door was shut, so he looked in at the window, and he saw the young artist working at his beautiful piece of carving, which was almost finished. Evelyn was so astonished at finding such a skillful craftsman living so humbly that he asked him if he might come in and speak to him. Gibbons opened the door quite civilly, and Evelyn tells us that when he saw the work close at hand, he was quite amazed at its beauty and delicacy. He asked the young carver why he lived in such a lonely spot, and Gibbons told him that he wanted to have time to work hard at his profession without interruption. Then Evelyn, who was always ready to do a kind action and to help people, volunteered to introduce him to some great man who might perhaps buy the piece of carving, and asked the sum for which Gibbons would sell it. The craftsman replied modestly that he was but a beginner, but he thought that the carving was worth £100. Mr. Evelyn thought it was quite worth £100 too, and so the very next time that he went to court, he told King Charles about it, and asked him if he might invite the young artist to bring the piece of work to Whitehall when it was finished, in order that the king might see it. King Charles said yes, and kind-hearted John Evelyn was delighted, for he felt certain that as soon as the king saw it, he would buy it. But alas, his expectations were dashed to the ground by a French peddling woman who sold petticoats and fawns and baubles out of France to the queen and ladies of her court, and this was how it happened. When the piece of carving was brought to the palace, the king admired it very much and would have bought it, but he thought that he would ask his wife first how she liked it. So he gave orders that it was to be carried into the queen's apartments so that she could see it. She also admired it and was anxious that the king should buy it, but an old Frenchwoman chanced to be in the room, the peddling woman, as Evelyn calls her, who was in the habit of bringing over gloves and fans and things of that sort from France, and selling them to the court ladies. When she heard the price that Charles proposed to give for the carving, she was afraid that the queen would run short of money, and so would not be able to buy so many things from her as she usually did. So when the king left the room, she began to criticize the carving and to find fault with it, and the foolish queen believed that what she said was true, and when the king came back, she persuaded him not to buy it. So poor Grinling had to carry it back to his little cottage at Deptford, and he afterwards sold it to a nobleman for £80. But although his first attempt at helping Grinling Gibbons had not succeeded very well, kind Mr. Evelyn did not give it up. He happened to know Sir Christopher Wren, and as Sir Christopher was busy at that time over the building of the new cathedral, he went and saw him and told him about his protégé, and asked him if he could not give him something to do. And Sir Christopher, who was looking about for someone to carve the woodwork of the stalls, went down and saw Gibbons' work, and was so pleased with it that he engaged him at once to come and help him. And of course, when Gibbons did this, he soon became famous, and had no more trouble in obtaining orders. Now perhaps you may feel inclined to ask if all the monuments in St. Paul's Cathedral are erected to the memory of men who died far away in other lands. It looks like it, does it not? For we have seen Gordon's monument, who died at Khartoum, and Moore's, who died in Spain, and Bishop Heber's, who died in India, and that of the colonial soldiers who died in South Africa. And if we go on looking, we shall find very many more to the memory of soldiers and sailors who fought our battles and guarded our shores, but whose bones are resting in foreign lands, or mayhap under the rolling waves of the sea. But if we go down to the crypt, we shall find that there are some graves there. 2 of them I am sure that you would like to look at for a moment, because they are the graves of 2 men whose memory will be kept green as long as the English nation lasts. One of them was her greatest soldier, and the other her greatest sailor. I need not tell you their names, need I? Arthur, Duke of Wellington, the Iron Duke, as men called him, and Horatio, Lord Nelson, who died at Trafalgar on board the Victory. There are 2 monuments erected to them upstairs in the great church. That to Wellington is enormous and stands just across the aisle from General Gordon's. Nelson's monument is on the other side of the cathedral, just at the corner of the south transept, and is more interesting to look at than that of Wellington, for it represents the famous admiral standing with one sleeve empty, for, as you remember, his right arm was shot away at the Battle of Teneriffe, while underneath are carved the names of his greatest sea fights, Copenhagen, Nile, and Trafalgar. Lower still is the British lion, emblem of the land he fought for, and the figure of Britannia, pointing out the great sailor to 2 little middies and telling them to follow in his steps. But when, in 1805, Nelson died on board his battleship, the English people felt that it was not enough that a monument should be put up to his memory in the citizen church of their capital. They wanted his body to rest amongst them. So it was brought home, and amid general lamentation was buried in this still and silent crypt. 47 years passed, and once more the whole nation was mourning, for the Duke of Wellington was dead. He had not died in action, as did Nelson, but had fought his fights and won his victories and conquered Napoleon, and had lived to come home and enter Parliament and serve his country as a politician as well as a soldier. And when the question arose as to where he should be buried, it was felt to be fitting that he, the greatest soldier, as Tennyson called him, should be brought and laid beside the greatest sailor, and that the sound of those he wrought for and the feet of those he fought for should echo round his bones for evermore. Do you know how his body was brought through the streets of London? Look at this enormous funeral car standing under this dark arch, and you will see. It looks so strange and fantastic that at first sight you hardly know what it is meant for, but you must remember that it was not made out of ordinary wood, like carts and wagons. It was made out of iron, out of old cannon which had done their part in the great soldiers' victories. Look at the names of these victories, 24 of them, engraved upon the body of the car. You can think what a solemn procession it must have been, as the mighty soldier and prudent statesman was borne upon it, through more than 1 million silent onlookers, to his last long rest in St. Paul's. Here is another grave that we must look at ere we leave the crypt. It cannot be an important one, you say, for there is no monument over it, only an inscription. Ah, yes, but read the inscription. Lector, si monumentum requiris, circumspice. Reader, if thou requirest a monument, look around. That tells us at once whose grave it is. It is Christopher Wren's. And as we do his bidding and look around and above us, and as we ascend the stairs once more and enter the magnificent cathedral and walk down the nave to the great west door, we feel that no smaller monument could have been erected to the man whose marvelous skill planned it all. End of section 4. End of Tales of English Minsters, Canterbury Cathedral, Kent, and St. Paul's Cathedral, London, by Elizabeth Wilson Grierson.